The sharp, resounding crack of the slap sliced through the clamor of the gas station, louder than the hum of engines or the chatter of hurried voices. It was a sound that demanded attention. A violent interruption that silenced the mundane symphony of the afternoon. Heads swiveled, conversations faltered. And eyes widened as the scene unfolded under the unrelenting glare of the midday sun. A boy, barely past the cusp of childhood at 12 years old, reeled backward. His small frame unsteady as he pressed a trembling hand to his reddened cheek. Tears welled in his dark, expressive eyes that now stared up in disbelief at the towering figure before him. The officer, a hulking man in a crisp uniform that shimmered with authority, loomed over him, his face contorted into a sneer that oozed self-satisfaction. His voice boomed, harsh and unyielding. As he barked, I said, "Get out of the car." With a grip like iron, he seized the boy's thin wrist, yanking him forward with such force that the child's sneakers scuffed against the asphalt. His body jerked like a puppet caught in a storm. Malik Carter, the boy, felt his heart hammering in his chest, a frantic rhythm that drowned out the world around him. He was no stranger to quiet fears, those little anxieties that crept into his mind when he sat alone with his sketchbook, drawing heroes who always knew what to do. But this was different. This was real, raw, and terrifying. His cheek burned, the sting radiating outward, but it was the officer's venomous tone that cut deeper. "I wasn't doing anything, sir," Malik whispered. His voice so fragile it barely carried over the breeze. "I was just waiting for my dad." The words trembled as they left his lips, a plea wrapped in innocence, but they were met with a snarl. "Shut your mouth," the officer snapped, his fingers tightening around Malik's wrist until the boy winced, his wide eyes darting around in search of help, or at least a witness who might care. The gas station was alive with activity, a mother pumping gas into her minivan, a truck driver sipping coffee by his rig, a teenager scrolling on his phone near the entrance. Yet, in that moment, it felt as though the world had shrunk to just the two of them, Malik and the officer, and the suffocating weight of power misused. The officer's gaze flicked around, scanning the onlookers with a predator's awareness, daring anyone to challenge him. "People like you think you can loiter wherever you want," he sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. "Not on my watch." To him, Malik wasn't a child waiting for his father, he was a symbol, a target for the frustration that simmered beneath his polished badge. Then came the sound of a car door opening, deliberate and steady, cutting through the tension like a metronome in a storm. Darren Carter stepped out of the black SUV. His movements smooth and unhurried, as if he'd rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in his mind. At 45, he carried himself with a quiet strength that didn't need to shout to be felt. His broad shoulders filled out the casual polo shirt he wore, and his dark eyes, sharp and assessing, betrayed no hint of the storm brewing inside him. To the casual observer, he might have been just another dad stepping in to sort out a misunderstanding. But there was something in the way he stood, feet planted, chin lifted, that made the air feel heavier, charged with an unspoken promise. The crowd sensed it too. A few bystanders shifted uncomfortably, their curiosity piqued by the calm radiating from this man in the face of such aggression. The officer's attention snapped to Darren, his bravado swelling like a balloon ready to burst. He saw nothing in Darren's plain jeans and unassuming demeanor to suggest anything extraordinary, just another face in the crowd, another person to dominate. "You got something to say?" he taunted. His hand still clamped around Malik's arm, fingers digging in as if to prove a point. "Maybe you should teach your kid some respect for authority before he ends up in real trouble." His words were a challenge, a spark tossed into dry grass, but Darren didn't flinch. His response came slow and deliberate, each syllable measured like the ticking of a clock. "Let him go," he said. His voice low and steady, slicing through the officer's bluster with surgical precision. A hollow laugh erupted from the officer, sharp and brittle, as he shook his head in disbelief. "Or what? You gonna step up?" His eyes narrowed, sizing Darren up with a mix of amusement and contempt. "Let me guess, you think you're someone important. I deal with your kind every day. Always thinking you can talk your way out of trouble." He was so wrapped up in his own narrative, so convinced of his untouchable power, that he missed the subtle shift in Darren's stance, the way his shoulders squared, the way his gaze hardened into something unyielding. "You're making a mistake," Darren replied. His tone as steady as a heartbeat, his eyes locked on the officer's with an intensity that could have stopped traffic. The officer rolled his eyes, a theatrical gesture meant to dismiss the warning. And with a rough shove, he pushed Malik toward the SUV. The boy stumbled, his knees buckling as he caught himself against the vehicle's door, the impact jarring his already shaken frame. Pain flared in his wrist where the officer's grip had left its mark. But it was the humiliation that stung worse, a public stripping of his dignity in front of strangers who now watched with a mix of pity and fascination. Darren stepped forward then, closing the distance between himself and the officer with a presence that seemed to fill the entire parking lot. His voice dropped, resonating with a depth that made the air tremble. "Do you even know who you just put your hands on?" he asked, the question hanging there like a guillotine blade poised to fall. The officer's laugh was colder this time, edged with defiance. "I don't care," he shot back, leaning in closer, his breath hot with arrogance. "You think a badge like mine takes orders from people like you?" His words were a wall, built brick by brick with years of unchecked entitlement, but they crumbled in the silence that followed, a silence so thick it drew the crowd in tighter. Strangers craning their necks to catch every word, every movement. Malik, still clutching his cheek, looked up at his father, his tear-streaked face softening with a flicker of hope. Darren's hand found his son's shoulder, steady and warm, a silent vow that this wouldn't end in defeat. And then Darren spoke again, his voice rising like thunder rolling across an open plain. "No," he said, pausing just long enough for the weight of it to settle, "but you will." The officer's smirk faltered, just for a heartbeat, replaced by a shadow of unease that flickered across his features. He straightened, towering over Darren with renewed aggression, his neck muscles taut as he growled, "Now that a threat? You're about to find out what happens when people like you cross me." But the threat rang hollow, a desperate grasp at control in a moment slipping from his hands. The crowd felt the shift before the officer did. Whispers rippled through the onlookers, soft at first, then growing into a murmur of recognition. A woman near the gas pump squinted, her brow furrowing as she pieced together the puzzle of Darren's face. "Wait," she muttered to the man beside her, her voice tinged with awe. "Isn't that?" The truck driver lowered his coffee cup, his grizzled face tightening with realization. "Holy hell," he breathed, "that's the chief." The teenager by the entrance looked up from his phone, eyes widening as he whispered to no one in particular, "Does he know who that is?" The air buzzed with electric anticipation, every breath heavy with the promise of what was to come. The officer, though, remained blinded by the arrogance that had carried him this far, by the belief that his badge was a shield against consequence. He didn't see the storm brewing, didn't feel the ground shifting beneath him. For him, this was just another day, another chance to flex his power over those he deemed beneath him. But for Malik, the slap still echoed in his ears. A wound that went beyond the physical. He clung to his father's presence, drawing strength from the man who'd always been his quiet hero, not the kind with capes and masks, but the kind who stood firm when the world turned cruel. Darren Carter wasn't just any father. He was the chief of police, a man who'd spent years navigating the murky waters of justice, ensuring that power was wielded with integrity rather than malice. That day, dressed in civilian clothes, he'd been nothing more than Darren, Malik's dad. A man thinking about lasagna and sketchbooks, until the officer's actions dragged him back into the role he wore so well. The slap, the humiliation, The audacity of it all, it was a spark that ignited something unstoppable. Justice, Darren knew, didn't whisper, it roared. And what came next would be a reckoning that shook the city to its core. The officer had no idea he'd just lit the fuse to his own downfall. His career, his reputation, everything he'd built on a foundation of unchecked power, teetered on the edge of collapse. The crowd watched, breathless, as the truth unfurled like a banner in the wind. Malik's fear began to fade, replaced by a fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, the nightmare would end, not in defeat, but in triumph. The lesson here wasn't just about one man's arrogance, it was about the cost of abusing power, the inevitability of consequences, and the fierce, unyielding pursuit of justice that follows. The gas station, once a backdrop to an ordinary afternoon, became a stage for a story that would echo for weeks, a reminder that even the smallest voices, when backed by truth, could topple giants. As Darren reached for the door to step outside, something flickered in his peripheral vision, a police cruiser rolling silently into the gas station lot. Its lights dimmed but its presence impossible to ignore. Decades of instinct, sharpened by years of navigating life's unpredictable currents, stirred faintly within him, though not yet enough to sound an alarm. That changed the moment the officer emerged from the vehicle. Officer Daniel Harper wasn't just any cop, he was a fixture on the force. A man in his late 30s whose lean, wiry frame and piercing blue eyes gave him the air of a predator constantly sizing up its surroundings. Those eyes, cold and calculating, darted across the lot with a scrutiny that felt less like vigilance and more like a hunt. Harper's reputation preceded him. A dark thread woven into hushed conversations in precinct break rooms and tense community gatherings. He wasn't the kind of veteran who inspired respect or admiration. No. Harper was the type who wore his badge like a crown, who saw his authority as a tool to wield over others rather than a duty to uphold. For years, he'd danced along the edge of accountability, his actions always teetering on the brink of misconduct, yet never quite tipping far enough to bring the full weight of discipline crashing down on him. Today, he was here, ostensibly for a routine patrol, though the glint in his eye suggested something more deliberate brewing beneath the surface. Outside, Malik sat in the family SUV, oblivious to the storm gathering around him. His pencil scratched softly across the pages of his sketchbook, tracing lines of a world only he could see, dragons soaring over jagged mountains, knights clashing in silent battles. At 13, he was a quiet kid, small for his age, with a mop of dark curls and a tendency to lose himself in his drawings. The hum of engines and distant chatter from the gas station barely registered as he leaned back in the passenger seat, waiting for his dad to finish inside. He didn't notice Harper's gaze locking onto him, didn't sense the shift in the air as the officer's boots hit the pavement with purpose. Harper's strides were measured. Each step a quiet declaration of control, his hand resting casually on his belt where his holster sat. Something about Malik, the way he sat so still, so unassuming. His focus absorbed in his sketchbook, pricked at Harper's instincts. To him, quiet wasn't innocence, it was a mask for something sinister. A suspicion born from years of twisting every shadow into a threat. "Hey, you." Harper's voice sliced through the ambient noise, sharp and laced with an authority that demanded obedience. "What are you doing sitting in there? Step out of the car." Malik's hand froze mid-stroke, the pencil slipping from his fingers and clattering to the floorboard. His heart jolted. A sudden thud against his ribcage as he blinked up at the figure now looming outside the window. Was the officer talking to him? Uncertainty coiled in his chest. Tightening his breath as he fumbled with the door handle, cracking it open just enough to peer out. I'm just waiting for my dad," he stammered, his voice a fragile thread nearly lost in the breeze. "He's inside." Harper's response was immediate, a bark that brooked no hesitation, "Out. Now." The officer stepped closer, his shadow falling over Malik like a storm cloud. His face hardening into a mask of disdain. Inside the store, Darren caught the scene unfolding through the glass. His brow furrowed. A flicker of unease sparking deep in his gut as he saw Harper towering over his son's small frame. The grocery bag in his hand felt suddenly heavier. A tether keeping him grounded as his pulse quickened. He shoved the door open with his shoulder, stepping into the lot just as Harper leaned in closer to Malik, one hand gripping the SUV's door frame. Malik stumbled out, his sneakers scuffing the pavement, his wide brown eyes darting nervously as he clutched his sketchbook like a shield. Trembling, he tried to explain. His voice cracking under the weight of Harper's glare. "I wasn't doing anything, I swear," he said, the words tumbling out in a rush, raw and desperate. Harper's lips twisted into a sneer. His tone dripping with mockery. "Don't argue with me, kid. You think you can just sit around here looking suspicious? I've seen plenty of your type, loitering, stirring up trouble." Darren's footsteps echoed with purpose as he closed the distance, his jaw tight, his broad shoulders squared. Decades of life had etched lines into his face. But they hadn't dulled the quiet strength in his bearing. "What's going on here, officer?" His voice was steady, a low rumble that carried an unshakable weight, even as he kept it restrained. Harper turned, his lip curling slightly as he took in Darren, another civilian, another nobody daring to question him. "Your kid here was acting suspicious," Harper said. His words clipped and dismissive. "Probably up to no good." Darren's gaze slid to Malik, who stood frozen, his sketchbook pressed tight against his chest, his knuckles pale from the effort. The boy's fear was a silent scream in his eyes, but there was something else too, a flicker of trust, a hope pinned on his father's presence. A beat of silence stretched between them. Thick with unspoken stakes, before Darren spoke again, his voice dropping to a near whisper, each syllable deliberate. "Let him go." Harper's laugh was a jagged thing, sharp and mocking. Cutting through the tension like a blade. "Excuse me? You don't tell me how to do my job. Maybe you should teach your kid some respect." The air crackled. Drawing the eyes of other customers, a cashier pausing mid-transaction, a woman with a toddler clinging to her leg, a truck driver leaning against his rig. All of them watching as the scene teetered on the edge of something bigger. Darren stepped closer, his movements slow but unyielding, his calm facade a dam holding back a rising tide. "I said, let him go. He's done nothing wrong." Harper squared his shoulders, his chest puffing out as his voice rose, a challenge flung into the growing crowd. "And who exactly are you to tell me what to do? I don't take orders from you." Malik flinched as Harper's hand twitched toward him again, a reflex of dominance, but Darren's voice cut through the moment like a guillotine. "You're making a mistake." Harper was too entrenched in his own arrogance to hear the warning, too blinded by the power he thought he held. To him, Darren was just another man puffing out his chest. And Malik was just another kid who didn't fit his narrow vision of order. Harper leaned in closer, his smirk widening, his voice dropping to a venomous hiss meant only for Darren's ears. "I've seen your kind before. You think you're untouchable, but out here, I'm the one in charge." Darren's eyes locked onto Harper's, steely and unblinking, a quiet storm brewing behind them. "You'll regret this," he said, his tone flat but heavy, the words hanging in the air like the first rumble of distant thunder. Harper chuckled, brushing it off as bravado. Oblivious to the gravity he'd just stumbled into. Around them, the crowd's murmurs swelled, phones rising like a chorus of silent witnesses, capturing every angle of the standoff. Malik glanced up at his father, his fear softening into a fragile hope, a belief that Darren could unravel this nightmare. Darren's expression remained a mask of control, but beneath it, something simmered, a promise, a reckoning waiting to break free. Harper, still blind to the shift, turned his back on Darren, his focus snapping back to Malik with renewed intensity. But Darren didn't budge. He stood rooted to the spot, his presence a towering force amid the chaos, his silence speaking louder than any shout. The gas station lot. Once a humdrum stage for refueling and quick errands, now pulsed with an electric tension, a sense that the ordinary had fractured into something extraordinary. The bystanders, ordinary people with their own lives and struggles, felt it too. The cashier, a middle-aged woman named Linda with tired eyes and a habit of chewing her nails, whispered to her coworker about Harper's reputation, her voice trembling with unease. The truck driver, a grizzled man named Tom who'd seen his share of roadside disputes, tightened his grip on his coffee cup, sensing the weight of what was unfolding. Even the young mother, balancing her squirming toddler, paused to watch, her instincts screaming that this was no routine stop. The atmosphere grew heavier as Darren held his ground, his posture a pillar of defiance against Harper's bluster. The officer, emboldened by the growing audience, spun back toward Darren, his sneer twisting into something uglier. "Are you still standing there?" he spat, his hand resting pointedly on his belt. A reminder of the power he carried, or thought he did. "I told you to step back." His eyes flicked to Malik, who hugged his sketchbook tighter, the pages crinkling under his grip. "And as for you, don't think you're walking away from this without consequences. I know how kids like you operate." Malik's voice, small but defiant, broke through the haze of fear. "I didn't do anything wrong." The words trembled, but they carried a spark of courage, a refusal to bow under Harper's weight. The officer's laugh rang out again, cruel and piercing, loud enough to make Linda flinch behind the counter and Tom mutter a curse under his breath. "Wrong? You think loitering in someone else's car isn't suspicious? What do you even have in that notebook? Plans to rob this place?" Harper's accusation hung in the air, absurd and baseless, but delivered with the confidence of a man who'd never been forced to answer for his words. Darren's jaw tightened, a muscle twitching as he stepped forward, his voice cutting through Harper's mockery like a blade forged in fire. "That's enough. My son doesn't owe you an explanation. And if you keep pushing this, you'll find yourself facing questions you're not ready to answer." Harper turned slowly, his smirk faltering for a split second before hardening into something colder, more dangerous. He didn't know who Darren was, didn't care, just another face in a crowd he thought he could cow into submission. But Darren wasn't bending, and the crowd wasn't scattering. The phone stayed up. The whispers grew louder, and the air thrummed with the promise of consequences Harper couldn't yet fathom. In that moment, the lesson was clear. Though Harper was too drunk on his own power to see it, justice isn't a privilege bestowed by a badge, it's a force that rises when the powerless are pushed too far. Harper's abuse of authority, his casual cruelty, had ignited something bigger than himself, a reckoning that would ripple far beyond this dusty gas station lot. For Malik, trembling but standing, it was a lesson in resilience. A glimpse of the strength his father carried. For Darren, it was a reminder that power unchecked breeds its own downfall. And for the onlookers, Linda, Tom, the young mother, and the rest, it was a stark warning: when those who wield authority forget their duty, the consequences can shake the ground beneath them all. The air thickened with tension as Harper edged closer to Darren, his boots scuffing the cracked pavement of the gas station parking lot. His voice dropped to a menacing murmur, each word laced with a bitter edge. "I've dealt with your type before," he said, his eyes narrowing into slits. "You strut around like the law doesn't apply to you, huh? You think a few clever sentences give you the right to push me around?" Inside, Harper's chest tightened with a mix of irritation and something darker, a gnawing need to prove he still held the reins. He'd spent years building that armor of authority, and this man's quiet defiance felt like a chisel chipping away at it. Darren stood his ground, unyielding. his gaze locking onto Harper's with a piercing calm that seemed to slice through the officer's bluster. His face didn't twitch, not even a flicker of fear crossed it, but beneath that steady exterior, a storm churned. He wasn't just angry, he was resolute, a man who'd seen enough in his life to know when silence spoke louder than shouts. "Intimidate you?" he replied, his voice low and deliberate, each syllable heavy with intent. "No. But I will make sure you answer for this." The words lingered in the air like smoke, a vow wrapped in unshakable certainty that made Harper's bravado waver. If only for a heartbeat. Darren's mind raced, not with doubt, but with a fierce determination to shield his son and expose the fragility of the power Harper clung to so desperately. Harper's hand slid to his belt, fingers brushing the cold metal of his badge in a calculated move. It wasn't just habit. It was a reminder, to himself and to Darren, that he was the one in charge here. Or so he told himself. Inside, a flicker of unease danced in his gut, but he smothered it with a scoff. "Accountable?" He spat, his lips curling into a sneer. "You're out of your depth, old man. You don't even know who you're talking to." His voice carried a bravado he didn't entirely feel. A mask to hide the tremor of doubt Darren's words had planted. From the fringes of the gathering crowd, a shaky voice broke through the haze of tension. It belonged to a woman. Her hands trembling as she clutched her purse, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and righteous indignation. "Why are you even bothering them?" she stammered, her tone rising with every word. "That kid didn't do a thing. You're the one out of line here." She wasn't loud by nature, her husband often teased her for her soft-spoken ways, but something about this scene had snapped a chord inside her. She couldn't stand by and watch a boy and his father be harassed for no reason. Harper's head whipped around, his glare sharp enough to cut glass. "Mind your own damn business," he barked. His voice a whip crack that silenced her instantly. Her shoulders slumped, but her eyes still burned with quiet defiance as she stepped back into the crowd. Harper turned back to Darren and Malik, his chest puffing out as he tried to reclaim the moment. "This isn't up for discussion," he growled. "You don't get to call the shots here." Malik stood just behind his father, his breath coming in shallow bursts as his fingers tightened around the worn edges of his sketchbook. The pencil lines he'd been tracing earlier, a jagged cityscape born from his restless imagination, now felt like a distant memory. His heart pounded, not just from fear, but from the weight of his father's hand resting on his shoulder. That touch was an anchor, a silent promise that steadied him even as the world seemed to tilt under Harper's looming presence. Inside, Malik wrestled with a tangle of emotions, fear of the officer's anger, pride in his father's courage, and a fragile hope that this wouldn't end in chaos. Darren's voice cut through the silence again. Low but unyielding, like the rumble of distant thunder. "I'm not making demands, officer," he said, his eyes never leaving Harper's. "I'm giving you a chance to step back before this spirals beyond your control." There was no malice in his tone, only a quiet certainty that made the hairs on Harper's neck prickle. Darren wasn't bluffing, he'd seen men like Harper before, puffed up with power they didn't fully understand, and he knew how quickly that house of cards could collapse. Harper's face twisted into a sneer, his laugh echoing hollowly across the parking lot, bouncing off the rusted gas pumps and the flickering neon sign above. "Worse," he mocked, his voice dripping with disdain. "You're out of your mind. You have no idea who you're messing with." But beneath the bravado, a bead of sweat trickled down his temple. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, a restless hum that pressed against his ears. Phones glinted in the dim light, their lenses trained on him like unblinking eyes, recording every move. The weight of their scrutiny bore down on him, and for a fleeting moment, he wondered if he'd misjudged the situation. Darren didn't flinch. His expression remained a mask of calm. But behind his steady gaze, a fire simmered, a controlled fury born from years of standing up to men who thought a badge or a title made them untouchable. He took a small step forward, closing the gap between them, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried more force than a shout. "You think you're the one in charge here," he said, "but that's an illusion. It's slipping away from you, and you don't even see it." The words hit Harper like a physical blow, stripping away the last threads of his confidence. Before Harper could muster a retort, a new voice sliced through the tension, sharp and commanding. "What's going on here?" The crowd parted slightly, revealing a second officer striding toward them. He was younger than Harper, his uniform crisp and his posture less rigid, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease as he surveyed the scene. His name tag read Carter, and his brow furrowed as he took in the standoff, Harper's clenched jaw, Darren's unshakable calm, and Malik's wide-eyed tension. Inside, Carter's stomach churned. He'd joined the force to help people, not to wade into messes like this, and something about Harper's aggression set his nerves on edge. "Daniel, what's this about?" Carter asked, his tone cautious but firm. Harper stiffened, his bravado faltering as he gestured toward Malik. "Loitering. Suspicious behavior," he said curtly. "I've got it under control." But the words sounded hollow even to his own ears, and Carter's frown deepened. He studied Darren and Malik more closely, his gaze lingering on the older man's quiet strength. Something tugged at the back of his mind, a memory, a name, a story he couldn't quite place. "Suspicious behavior?" Carter echoed, his voice tinged with doubt. "He's just a kid sitting in a car. Are you sure this is worth it?" Harper's face flushed red, his frustration boiling over. "Don't question me, Carter," he snapped, his voice rising. "I know what I'm doing." But Carter wasn't so sure. His eyes darted back to Darren, and recognition flickered in his expression, slow and unsteady. His breath caught as the pieces clicked into place. "Wait," he began, but Darren raised a hand, cutting him off with a gesture that was both gentle and commanding. "I'm this boy's father," Darren said, his voice steady as steel. "That's all you need to know right now." His eyes remained fixed on Harper, unwavering, a silent challenge that spoke volumes. Carter swallowed hard, stepping back slightly, his unease growing. He wasn't like Harper, he didn't thrive on confrontation. He'd seen the older officer push boundaries before, but this felt different, heavier. Like they were teetering on the edge of something irreversible. Harper, oblivious to his partner's hesitation, pressed on, his voice booming with forced authority. "I don't care who you are," he snarled. "This is my scene, and I'll handle it how I damn well please." But Darren's silence was louder than Harper's bluster, a deafening stillness that seemed to suck the air from the moment. The crowd watched, their breaths held, as the tension crackled like static electricity. Malik glanced up at his father, his fear softening into something stronger, a glimmer of trust. A belief that Darren's quiet power might just turn the tide. Harper's smirk faltered, a shadow of doubt creeping across his face. For the first time, he felt the ground shift beneath him. The control he'd clung to slipping through his fingers. The parking lot fell into a restless hush, the kind of silence that hums with unspoken promises. Darren stood tall, his hand still resting on Malik's shoulder, a pillar of strength amid Harper's crumbling facade. Carter lingered on the sidelines, his mind racing as he grappled with the weight of what he was witnessing. What unfolded that evening wasn't just a clash of wills, it was a lesson carved in the raw edges of power and accountability. Harper's arrogance had blinded him, but the consequences of his actions were closing in, relentless and inevitable. For Darren, it was a stand not just for his son, but for a deeper truth. That justice, when wielded with quiet resolve, could topple even the most stubborn towers of authority. And as the crowd held its breath, waiting for the next move, it was clear that this was only the beginning, a spark that would ignite a reckoning none of them could yet fathom. The air hung heavy with tension as Malik fidgeted beside his father, his small hands gripping his sketchbook so tightly that his knuckles gleamed white under the afternoon sun. The boy's dark eyes darted nervously between the ground and the man standing before them, Officer Harper, whose towering figure cast a shadow that seemed to swallow the light around them. Malik's breaths came shallow and quick, his mind racing with a jumble of fear and confusion. What had he done wrong? He'd just been sitting there, doodling in his book, waiting for his dad to finish whatever errand had brought them to this dusty street corner. Now, the world felt like it was tilting beneath his sneakers, and all he could do was cling to the familiar weight of his father's presence. Darren, tall and broad-shouldered, stood like an unshakable oak beside his son. His deep brown eyes never wavered from Harper's face, though his hand reached out to rest gently on Malik's trembling arm. The touch was warm, steadying. A silent promise that no matter how loud the storm grew, he'd shield his boy from its fury. "It's all right, Malik," he murmured, his voice low and soothing, like the hum of a distant river. "Just stay close to me." Inside, though, Darren's chest tightened with a slow-burning anger. He could feel the eyes of the gathering crowd, neighbors, strangers. People with phones already raised, watching, judging, waiting for the next move. This wasn't just about him or Malik anymore, it was about something bigger. Something that gnawed at his soul every time he saw power wielded like a club instead of a shield. Harper's laugh cut through the moment like a jagged blade, sharp and grating, slicing through the murmurs of the onlookers. His lips curled into a sneer, his broad chest puffing out beneath the crisp lines of his uniform as he leaned forward, hands resting casually on his belt. "Stay close," he mocked, his voice dripping with disdain. "What do you think you're protecting him from, me? I'm doing my damn job here. Maybe if you'd taught that kid of yours some respect, we wouldn't be standing here having this little chat." The words landed like a slap, raw and stinging, and the crowd shifted uncomfortably, a ripple of unease spreading through them. A woman in a faded red jacket whispered something to the man beside her, their faces tightening with disapproval. Malik flinched, his shoulders hunching as if he could shrink away from the accusation. But Darren's grip on his arm tightened just enough to keep him grounded. Darren's gaze darkened, a storm brewing behind his calm exterior. He took a single, deliberate step forward, his boots scuffing softly against the cracked pavement. His voice remained steady, measured, but there was a new edge to it, a quiet sharpness that cut deeper than any shout. "My son doesn't need to learn respect from the likes of you," he said, each word deliberate, heavy with meaning. "And if you had even the faintest idea what it means to wear that uniform, you'd know respect isn't something you demand, it's something you earn." His eyes locked onto Harper's, unyielding, a challenge wrapped in composure. Inside, Darren's heart pounded, not with fear, but with the weight of a truth he'd carried for years. Power without principle was a hollow shell, and men like Harper were its loudest echoes. Harper bristled, his ruddy face flushing a deeper shade of red. His hand twitched toward his belt again, hovering near the holstered weapon that gleamed dully in the sunlight. "You don't get to talk to me like that," he snapped, his voice rising with indignation. "You don't even know who you're dealing with." His chest heaved, his confidence teetering on the edge of bravado. But there was something unsteady in his eyes, a flicker of doubt that betrayed the bluster. Darren didn't flinch. A glint sparked in his gaze, sharp and piercing, and for a fleeting second, Harper faltered, his bravado cracking under the weight of that unflinching stare. Beside Harper stood a younger officer, barely out of his 20s. His uniform still creased with the stiffness of newness. His name tag read Ellis, and his round face was etched with growing unease. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his boots scraping nervously against the pavement as he watched the confrontation unfold. "Harper," he said, his voice tentative, almost swallowed by the tension in the air. Maybe we should take a step back. I think. Quiet. Harper barked, whirling on his partner with a ferocity that made Ellis recoil. I don't need your input, rookie. I've got this under control. But the words rang hollow. The crowd could see it, the way Harper's hands clenched and unclenched, the way his shoulders stiffened as if he could will authority back into his grasp. Control was slipping through his fingers like sand, and every sharp word only dug the hole deeper. Ellis swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing as he glanced toward Darren, then back at Harper. Torn between loyalty and the gnawing sense that something was spiraling horribly out of hand. Darren tilted his head slightly, a subtle movement that carried the weight of a judge's gavel. Do you? Officer Harper, he asked, his voice calm but laced with a deliberate precision that made the air feel colder. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've lost control entirely. The words hung there, quiet but unyielding, a mirror held up to Harper's unraveling facade. Malik peeked up at his father, his wide eyes reflecting a mix of pride and bewilderment. He'd always known his dad was strong, but this was something else, something that made his young heart swell even as fear lingered in its corners. Harper's jaw tightened, his teeth grinding audibly as his confidence wavered. You don't know anything about me, he shot back, his voice rising in pitch, cracking at the edges. I've been doing this job for years. I know what trouble looks like. He jabbed a finger toward Darren, but the gesture lacked conviction, trembling slightly as it hung in the air. Darren took another step forward. His presence filling the space not with noise or aggression, but with a quiet, undeniable power that seemed to root itself in the earth beneath him. Do you? He countered, his tone steady as stone. Because right now, all I see is a man so wrapped up in his own arrogance that he doesn't even feel the ground crumbling under his feet. Ellis cleared his throat. The sound sharp and awkward in the charged silence. Harper, listen, he said, his voice stronger now, though still tinged with hesitation. I think we should call this in. Get a supervisor down here. His eyes flicked toward Darren, then back to his partner, a plea buried in their depths. He'd seen enough in his short time on the force to know when a situation was veering into dangerous territory, and every instinct screamed that this was one of those moments. Harper spun on him, his anger flaring like a cornered animal. Are you serious? He hissed, his face contorting with frustration. I don't need a damn supervisor to handle this. This guy thinks he's untouchable. And I'm not letting him walk away like nothing happened. The words lingered, bitter and brittle, charging the air with a tension that prickled the skin. Darren exhaled slowly, his breath a measured release of the fury he kept tightly leashed. Untouchable, he repeated, his voice dropping to a near whisper, yet carrying the weight of thunder. No, Officer Harper. I'm not untouchable. But you're about to learn what accountability looks like. Harper blinked, a ripple of unease washing over him as Darren's tone shifted, calm, yes. But with an edge that promised consequences as inevitable as the tide. Before Harper could muster a retort, the sharp creak of a car door pierced the air. Darren turned with deliberate grace, his movement smooth and unhurried, and reached into the SUV parked a few feet away. The crowd leaned forward, breaths held, as he retrieved something from the passenger seat. When he straightened, a sleek black badge case rested in his hand, its surface catching the sunlight with a faint, authoritative gleam. Harper's eyes narrowed, confusion flickering across his face like a shadow. What the hell is that supposed to be? He demanded, though his voice wavered, uncertainty creeping in. Darren flipped the case open with a practiced flick of his wrist, revealing a badge that shone with quiet power. Chief Darren Carter, he said, his voice steady, resonant, carrying the full weight of his title. Head of the police department. Your boss. The words landed like a thunderclap, reverberating through the crowd in a collective gasp that seemed to shake the very pavement. Harper's face drained of color, his arrogance dissolving into a pale, panicked mask as his mind scrambled to catch up. What?" he stammered, stumbling back a step, his hand falling limply from his belt. Darren stepped closer, the badge still in hand, his expression unrelenting. "You didn't bother to ask, did you?" he said, his voice a blade honed by years of experience. "You were so busy flexing your authority that you didn't even stop to consider who you were dealing with. Let me make it clear for you, Officer Harper. You just assaulted the son of your commanding officer." Harper's knees buckled slightly, his breath hitching as panic clawed its way up his throat. This can't be real," he choked out, shaking his head. "You're lying." Ellis stared at Darren, his wide eyes snapping with recognition. "He's not lying, Harper," he said, his voice trembling but firm. "I've seen him before. That's Chief Carter." The young officer's hands fidgeted at his sides, his mind racing as the pieces fell into place. He'd heard stories about the chief, quiet, fair, but unrelenting when it came to justice, and now, standing in the shadow of that reputation, he felt a mix of awe and dread. Darren didn't wait for Harper to respond. He took another step forward, his voice calm but cutting like a razor through silk. "You've spent your career hiding behind that badge, using it as a shield to excuse behavior that has no place in this department. And today, you crossed a line you can't walk back from." Harper's hands trembled, his bravado shattered as he grasped for words. This is a misunderstanding," he stammered, his voice thin and desperate. "I didn't know. I didn't mean." "You didn't mean to get caught," Darren interrupted, his tone firm, unyielding. "That's the only truth in your words right now." The crowd watched in stunned silence. Phones still recording, capturing every second of Harper's unraveling. His confidence had crumbled, replaced by the stark, cold reality of his actions. Darren loomed over him, not in height, but in the sheer weight of his authority, a force that carried the promise of justice as sure as the sun would set. Malik stood close, his sketchbook pressed against his chest, his eyes wide with a mixture of relief and wonder. He'd never seen his father like this, not just strong, but invincible, a pillar of right in a world that sometimes felt so wrong. The crowd held its breath, the air thick with the weight of what had just unfolded. Harper's fall had begun, a slow, inevitable descent born of his own hubris, and there was no escaping it now. The reckoning had arrived, undeniable and unforgettable, a lesson etched in the dust of that street. Power abused was power lost, and justice, when it came, spared no one. In the stifling heat of the late afternoon, Officer Harper felt a lump lodge itself in his throat, a suffocating knot that tightened with every passing second. He fumbled for words, his mind racing as he tried to claw his way out of the mess he'd made. His lips parted, a shaky breath escaping as he stammered, "It wasn't like that, I thought," but before he could finish, Darren's voice sliced through the air like a blade, sharp and unyielding. "You thought?" Darren's tone grew colder, each syllable dripping with a quiet fury that made the hairs on Harper's neck stand on end. "You thought you held all the power, didn't you? You believed you could do whatever you wanted. No questions asked, because you've slipped through the cracks before. Tell me, Harper, am I wrong?" Beside Harper, the younger officer shifted on his feet, his boots scuffing against the cracked asphalt of the parking lot. His face was ashen, drained of color, and his eyes darted anywhere but toward Darren's piercing stare. The weight of that gaze felt like a physical force, pinning him in place. "Chief," he muttered, his voice trembling as he tried to interject, I tried to step in. I told him we should back off." But, Darren's hand shot up, palm out, silencing him mid-sentence. "Enough," Darren said, his tone firm but not cruel. "This isn't about you, not yet. But don't fool yourself into thinking your silence washes your hands clean. You had a chance to stop this train wreck, and instead, you stood there, watching it barrel forward. That's a choice you'll have to live with. The younger officer's head dipped low, his cap casting a shadow over his face. Shame carved itself into the tight lines of his mouth. The slump of his shoulders, as if he wished the ground would swallow him whole. Harper, meanwhile, was unraveling. The bravado he'd worn like armor minutes ago had melted away, leaving behind a man scrambling for footing on a crumbling ledge. His hands shook as he gestured toward Darren, fingers twitching with a mix of fear and desperation. "Look, Chief. I'll own up to it, I messed up," he pleaded, his voice cracking at the edges. "But you've got to believe me, I never meant for it to spiral like this. I was just trying to do my job. Keep things under control." Darren's response was a laugh, a low, bitter sound that rolled out of him like a storm cloud breaking open. It wasn't loud, but it cut deeper than any shout could, slicing through Harper's flimsy excuses. "Your job," Darren repeated, his eyes narrowing. "Your job is to protect people, to serve them, not to swing your badge around like a club, terrorizing anyone who crosses your path." "My son," his voice faltered for a split second, thick with emotion, before he pressed on. "My son was sitting in our car, minding his own business, doodling in his sketchbook, a pencil in his hand. Harper, tell me, where in your training does it say a kid with a pencil is a threat?" Harper flinched as if Darren had struck him. His eyes darted wildly, scanning the growing crowd that had gathered in the parking lot. Faces stared back, some curious, some furious, all judging. The murmurs of the onlookers blended into a dull roar, a chorus of whispers that pressed against him like a tightening noose. He felt their stares boring into him, stripping away the last threads of his composure. "Chief, I didn't know," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't think, that's the problem," Darren snapped, stepping closer, his presence towering over Harper like a tidal wave about to crash. "You didn't think. You didn't pause. You didn't care enough to weigh what your actions would do. And now, you're going to answer for it." The color drained from Harper's face, leaving him ghostly pale. He stumbled back a step, his polished boots scuffing the pavement, his once confident posture crumbling into something small and fragile. "Look, I'll cooperate," he said, his voice rising with a frantic edge. "I'll apologize to your son, Chief. We can keep this quiet, it doesn't have to blow up like this." At that moment, a new voice broke through the tension, small but steady, cutting through the haze of Harper's desperation. It was Malik, Darren's son, who had been silent until now, clutching his sketchbook to his chest like a shield. His dark eyes locked onto Harper's, and though his frame was slight, his words carried a weight that belied his age. "You think saying sorry fixes it?" he asked, his voice trembling but firm. "You humiliated me. You made me feel like I was less than nothing." Harper turned toward the boy, his expression flickering with something that might have been regret, or perhaps just the fear of being caught. Before he could respond, Darren stepped between them, his broad shoulders forming an impenetrable wall. "Don't you dare try to talk your way out of this with him," Darren growled, his voice low and dangerous. "My son doesn't need your hollow apologies. What he needs, what he deserves, is to see that men like you don't get to wield power unchecked. He needs to know justice isn't just a fairy tale." The crowd's energy shifted, a ripple of approval surging through them. Phones were raised higher, their lenses glinting in the fading sunlight as they recorded every word, every gesture. The air buzzed with anticipation, thick with the scent of gasoline and the distant hum of traffic. Harper's breathing grew shallow, his chest heaving as the reality crashed over him. This wasn't going to fade away with a handshake or a quiet deal. "Chief Carter," Please, he begged, his voice cracking like thin ice. We can sort this out internally. There's no need to drag it all out like this. Darren took another step forward, his shadow falling over Harper like a sentence being passed. Internally, he echoed, incredulous. You think I'd let you slink back to that precinct and sweep this under the rug? No, Harper. This ends here, today. Harper's voice broke completely as he made one final, pitiful attempt to save himself. I've been on the force for years, Chief. I've done good things, real good. One slip-up doesn't erase all that. It doesn't define who I am. Darren's gaze hardened, his eyes glinting with the resolve of a man who'd seen too many excuses, too much pain, and had run out of patience for both. It's not one slip-up, he said, his voice quiet but heavy, each word landing like a hammer on an anvil. It's a chain of choices, arrogance, abuse, hiding behind that badge like it makes you untouchable. You've worn that uniform for years, sure. But today you proved you don't belong in it. From the sidelines, the younger officer stepped forward, his hands trembling as he clutched his radio. His voice was soft, hesitant. But there was a flicker of determination beneath the fear. Chief, what do you want us to do? How do we make this right? Darren turned to him, and for a moment, his expression softened, just a fraction, a glimmer of hope for the man who still had a chance to learn. You call it in, he said firmly. You follow every rule in the book. You document this, every detail, every step. No shortcuts, no cover-ups. That's how you start. The younger officer nodded, fumbling with his radio as he spoke into it. His words shaky but clear as he requested a supervisor and internal affairs. Harper's face twisted in a final burst of desperation. Wait, he shouted, lunging forward as if he could physically stop the call. You don't have to do this, you don't get what this'll do to me. Darren's response was as cold and unyielding as steel. What it'll do to you? He said, his voice cutting through the chaos. My son will carry the scars of this day for the rest of his life. You'll face what's coming to you, Harper. And maybe then you'll understand what accountability feels like. That's justice, not just for Malik, but for everyone you've ever wronged. As the younger officer's voice crackled over the radio, the crowd erupted, their cheers rising like a wave crashing against the shore. They clapped and shouted, their support for Darren and Malik reverberating through the parking lot. Harper stood frozen, a statue of a man watching his world collapse. His uniform, once a symbol of authority, now hung on him like a tattered rag, useless and empty. Darren turned to his son, his hand resting gently on Malik's shoulder. The boy's eyes shimmered with unshed tears, his fingers loosening their death grip on his sketchbook. It's over, Malik, Darren said softly, his voice a balm against the storm they'd weathered. You're safe now. Malik looked up at his father, a faint smile breaking through the tension in his face. Thank you, Dad, he whispered, his voice thick with gratitude. Darren's eyes lingered on his son, a fierce pride burning beneath the exhaustion. No, son, he replied, his tone steady and sure. Thank you, for reminding me why I fight. For you, for everyone who deserves better than what he tried to take from you. The parking lot pulsed with energy, the air heavy with the scent of justice finally tipping the scales. Harper's silence was deafening, his once commanding presence reduced to a hollow shell. A man stripped bare by the consequences of his own making. The younger officer stood off to the side, his radio now quiet, his hand still trembling as he processed the weight of his own role in the unfolding drama. The crowd lingered, their phones still recording, their voices still humming with the promise that this moment would ripple far beyond the cracked pavement they stood on. It was a reckoning, a stark, unshakable reminder that power misused comes with a price, and that true justice isn't just a fleeting hope, but a living, breathing force that demands to be reckoned with. In Darren's trembling hand, the badge still gleamed faintly under the fading afternoon sun, a hollow symbol of the power he had once brandished with reckless abandon. That authority, which he had worn like a second skin, had been torn away in an instant, leaving him raw and defenseless in a way he had never imagined possible. His chest tightened as he stood there, the air thick with the stares of onlookers, their judgment pressing down on him like a physical force. He parted his lips to speak, to offer some defense or plea, but his voice betrayed him. Swallowed by the crushing weight of his own words echoing back, words of command and cruelty now turned against him. The realization of what lay ahead, the consequences he could no longer escape, choked him into silence. Beside him, a younger officer lowered his radio with a slow, deliberate motion, his face a battlefield of conflicting emotions. Respect for Darren, his chief, wrestled with the unease that gnawed at him, a quiet dread about what he'd just witnessed. His voice wavered slightly as he turned to Darren, eyes flickering with hesitation. "Chief, I've called internal affairs and the supervisor on duty. They're on their way to take over. Is there anything else you need me to do right now?" His fingers fidgeted with the radio, betraying his nerves as he awaited a response. Darren's gaze lingered on Harper, the officer at the center of this storm, for a long, heavy moment. Harper stood frozen, his broad shoulders hunched as if trying to shrink from the spotlight of shame and now fixed upon him. Finally, Darren turned to the younger officer, his voice steady despite the turmoil swirling within him. "You did the right thing by reporting this. Now, I need you to make sure every single detail gets written down, every word spoken, every action taken. I won't let any of this be buried or forgotten." The younger officer nodded quickly, fumbling for a notepad in his pocket. His pen scratched against the paper with a nervous energy as he began to record the scene, glancing up now and then as if to ensure he hadn't missed a single breath. Darren's tone softened, though his resolve remained ironclad. "And when they arrive, make it clear this isn't just about today. This is about a pattern, a string of choices that don't belong in this department, or anywhere near a badge." His words landed like a hammer, and Harper flinched visibly, his breath catching as the accusation sank in. For the first time, Harper's voice broke through the suffocating silence, a desperate, ragged plea. "Chief Carter, please, you don't have to do this. Don't throw my whole career away over one mistake." His hands twitched at his sides, itching to reach out, to grasp at the mercy he knew wasn't coming. Darren's head snapped back to Harper, his eyes blazing with an intensity that pinned the man in place. "Ruin your career," he said, his voice low and sharp, cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. "You did that yourself the second you let that badge twist into a license to degrade and hurt people. This isn't about me, Harper. It's about the trust you've shredded, not just with my family, but with every soul you've ever stepped on, every person you treated like they were nothing." The weight of his stare bore into Harper, who seemed to shrink further, his bravado crumbling under the truth he couldn't deny. The crowd stirred, a ripple of agreement passing through them like a quiet tide. Phones remained raised, their lenses capturing every trembling second of Harper's unraveling. The air buzzed with whispered conversations, some voices laced with anger, others with weary recognition. This wasn't the first time they'd seen power misused. Malik, Darren's son, edged closer to his father, his small frame still taut with the aftermath of fear. His voice was soft but steady, a thread of hope woven into his words. "Does this mean he can't hurt anyone else like he did to me?" He clutched his sketchbook, its edges worn from countless hours of drawing, a refuge from the world that had just turned so cruel. Darren glanced down at Malik, his stern expression melting into something tender yet resolute. That's what we're aiming for, Malik. To hold people like him accountable, so no one else has to feel what you felt today. Malik nodded slowly. His grip on the sketchbook easing as a faint glimmer of relief flickered across his face. Yet the shadows of fear and humiliation lingered in his wide eyes. A reminder of the wound that words and actions had carved into him. Darren rested a firm, reassuring hand on his son's shoulder, grounding them both as his attention swung back to Harper. "You think this is just about you," Darren said, his voice dropping to a near growl, "but it's so much bigger. It's about the community you swore to protect. The people you've let down over and over. It's about stopping that failure right here, right now." Harper's hands balled into fists, his knuckles widening as desperation clawed its way out. "I've done good things too," he shouted, his voice cracking. "I've risked my life for this department, doesn't that mean anything?" Darren's face remained unyielding. A stone wall against Harper's pleas. Doing your job doesn't give you a free pass to abuse your power. Being an officer isn't about medals or glory, it's about service. And every time you let arrogance or prejudice guide you, you spat on that duty. His words hung heavy in the air, a lesson etched in the silence that followed. Justice wasn't just about punishment. It was about stripping away the illusions that power could shield wrongdoing. The younger officer, still scribbling furiously in his notepad, paused, his pen hovering above the page. He looked up. His brow furrowed with a mix of guilt and resolve. "Chief, if I can say something. I've seen him do things before that didn't sit right. I kept quiet because I didn't think it was my place to speak up. I was scared of what might happen to me. But now," his voice trailed off, but his eyes burned with a newfound determination. Darren turned to him, his tone softening just enough to offer encouragement. "Now's your moment. If you've witnessed wrongdoing and stayed silent out of fear, this is your chance to stand for what's right. No one should feel helpless against injustice, not you, not anyone." The officer nodded. His jaw tightening as he returned to his notes with renewed purpose, each word a small rebellion against the silence he'd once kept. The distant wail of sirens pierced the stillness, growing louder as they approached. The crowd shifted, some drifting away while others lingered, their curiosity anchoring them to the unfolding drama. Harper's face drained of color, his eyes darting toward the sound as the reality of his fate settled like a noose around his neck. Darren turned to Malik, his voice quiet but firm. "Go sit in the car, son. You don't need to watch what comes next." Malik hesitated, his gaze flickering between his father and the restless crowd. "You sure?" he asked, his voice small. "I'm sure," Darren replied, nodding gently. "I'll be right there." Reluctantly, Malik shuffled toward the SUV, his sneakers scuffing the pavement. He climbed into the back seat, pulling the door shut with a soft thud, and pressed his forehead against the window, watching the scene shrink behind the glass. The siren swelled as a supervisor's marked car and an unmarked internal affairs vehicle rolled into the lot. Uniformed officers stepped out, their faces carved with seriousness as they surveyed the chaos. A woman with a commanding presence strode forward, her sharp eyes locking onto Darren. "Chief Carter," she said, her tone clipped but professional, "we got a call about an incident with one of our officers. What's the situation?" Darren met her gaze, his voice calm and measured. "There was an incident. I've instructed the reporting officer to document everything. You'll have witness statements, video evidence, plenty to work with." The internal affairs officers exchanged a quick glance before moving toward Harper, who looked as though he might collapse under their scrutiny. His badge, once a shield, now felt like a brand marking him for judgment. Darren stood rooted to the spot, his posture unwavering as the team began their work. The crowd thinned further, their murmurs fading into the evening breeze as the sun dipped lower, casting long, jagged shadows across the pavement. Darren exhaled slowly, the weight of the day pressing against his ribs. This wasn't the end of the struggle, but it was a stride towards something better, a reckoning for the misuse of power and a promise that justice could still hold sway. For now, that was enough. The parking lot, though nearly empty, still thrummed with a lingering tension, an invisible thread tying the day's events to the ground beneath their feet. A few stragglers remained, their eyes darting between Darren and the officers now escorting Harper away. The younger officer stood off to the side, his notepad clutched tightly, a silent witness to the lesson unfolding. Power without accountability was a hollow shell, and justice, though slow, would always demand its due. The officer who once strode with unshakable confidence now lingered a few yards away. His body slouched as if the weight of his own choices had finally caught up with him. His face, drained of color, bore the hollow look of a man stripped bare. A far cry from the authoritative figure who had bellowed orders just moments earlier. The crisp lines of his uniform seemed to sag with him, mirroring the collapse of his bravado. Malik, tucked into the back seat of the family SUV, hugged his knees tightly to his chest, his hands clutching the edges of his sketchbook like a lifeline. His fingers moved in restless, absent-minded circles over the worn corners of the pages, tracing invisible patterns as his mind churned through the whirlwind of events that had unfolded. Though the immediate danger had passed, and a fragile sense of safety had begun to settle over him, the echoes of fear and shame still clung to his spirit, tender and raw like bruises that refused to fade. Every so often, his dark eyes flickered toward his father, Darren, who stood at the heart of the chaos with a quiet, unyielding strength. To Malik, his dad was a paradox, both the gentle man who patiently untangled math problems with him at the kitchen table and chuckled at corny superhero flicks, and this towering figure now commanding the scene with a presence that demanded respect. The contrast left Malik's young mind spinning, grappling to piece together these two versions of the person he loved most. Darren cast a quick glance toward the SUV, his sharp gaze softening as it met his son's. For a fleeting second, the stern lines of his face melted into something tender, a wordless promise that everything would be all right. Malik felt it deep in his chest, a flicker of warmth cutting through the cold unease that had gripped him. Then, just as swiftly, Darren turned back to the cluster of officers before him, his expression hardening once more into a mask of resolve. His voice, when he spoke, was steady as stone, carrying the weight of a man who understood the gravity of the moment. Standing nearby, a tall internal affairs agent approached, his broad shoulders squared and his neatly trimmed beard framing a face etched with quiet authority. His tone was low and deliberate, the kind of measured calm that came from years of wading through tense, tangled situations. "Chief Carter," he began, his words clipped but professional, "we've taken the first steps. Witness statements are in, and we've gone over the footage submitted so far. It's clear there's more than enough here to launch a full investigation. Officer Harper won't be back on the streets anytime soon." The agent's voice held a firm resolve, a promise that the process would not falter. Darren gave a single, curt nod, his face unreadable, though a storm of thoughts churned behind his dark eyes. "Good," he replied, his tone clipped but insistent. "This has to be airtight. I want every detail on record, every word spoken, every move made. Nothing gets missed." The agent's demeanor shifted subtly, a trace of admiration threading through his steady voice. "You've got my word, Chief. We'll handle this by the book. And if I can say so, it's not every day you see someone in your position take such a hard line against one of their own. That takes guts." Darren met the man's gaze without flinching, his voice cool but edged with an unshakable conviction. "It shouldn't take guts. This is the bare minimum, the standard we're all supposed to live up to. Anything less, and we're failing the very people we swore to protect." The agent nodded, a faint spark of respect lighting his eyes before he stepped back to resume his work, leaving Darren to exhale a slow, measured breath. His attention shifted to Harper, who stood awkwardly at a distance, a broken shell of the man he'd been earlier. Gone was the bluster, the swagger that had fueled his reckless actions. Now, his shoulders hunched inward, his hands twitching nervously at his sides as if unsure where to settle. His pale face glistened with a sheen of sweat, and his eyes darted wildly, first to the internal affairs team, then to the small crowd of onlookers gathered at the edge of the scene. And finally back to Darren, searching for a lifeline in a situation spiraling beyond his control. At last, Harper's voice broke through the heavy silence, shaky and laced with desperation. "Chief Carter, I know I screwed up. I handled it all wrong, I get that. But do you really think I deserve to lose everything over this?" His words trembled in the air, fragile and pleading. Darren moved toward him with deliberate steps, his posture calm but radiating authority, each stride a testament to the weight he carried as both a leader and a father. When he spoke, his voice was even, but it bore the unmistakable force of truth. "You're asking the wrong thing, Harper. This isn't about what you think you deserve. It's about the damage you've done, the trust you've shattered. Not just with me, but with every single person you've wronged while hiding behind that badge." Harper's hands balled into weak, trembling fists, his voice rising in a feeble attempt to claw back some ground. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I was just trying to do my job." Darren's response came swift and sharp, cutting through the excuse like a blade. Your job is to serve, to protect, to uphold what this community stands for, to be a force for good. And what did you do today? You saw a kid sitting quietly in a car, my kid, and decided he was a threat. You acted without thought, without questions, without a shred of care for the harm you were causing. Tell me, Harper. How is that doing your job? Harper's mouth gaped open, but no sound emerged. The crushing weight of Darren's words seemed to snuff out whatever defense he'd been scrambling to muster. His shoulders slumped further, his head bowing as his gaze locked onto the cracked pavement beneath his boots. Darren stepped closer, his voice softening just enough to hint at sorrow, though its edge remained razor-sharp. This isn't just about today. It's about every time you've let your prejudice steer you. Every time you've abused your power because you figured no one would call you out. Well, today, that ends. Harper lifted his head, his face a mask of anguish, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. But I've done good things, Chief. I've put my life on the line for this department. Doesn't that mean anything? Darren's expression didn't waver, his voice steady as granite. Good deeds don't wipe out the bad ones, Harper. You don't get to cherry-pick when you uphold your oath, and you don't get to beg for mercy without owning up to the pain you've caused. Harper's voice cracked, a broken whisper spilling out. I didn't mean for it to go this far, I swear. Darren's tone dipped lower, carrying a quiet, mournful weight. Intentions don't undo the wreckage. What matters now is that you face what's coming. You didn't mean for this? Maybe not. But it happened, and now you answer for it. From the sidelines, a younger officer who had lingered silently throughout the exchange finally stepped forward, his movements hesitant but his jaw set with resolve. Clearing his throat, he spoke, his voice unsteady but firm. Chief Carter, I just want you to know, I'll put it all in my report. Everything. There were times before this when I saw Harper do things that didn't feel right. I kept quiet then, but I won't now. Darren turned to him, his gaze softening slightly, recognizing the courage it took to break the silence. It's never easy to speak up, especially in this job. But if you mean that, then make sure your report tells the whole truth, every detail. This isn't just about Harper. It's about dismantling a culture that lets this kind of behavior fester. The younger officer nodded, his posture straightening as a flicker of determination took root. "Yes, sir. I'll make sure it's done right." As the internal affairs team began to pack up, the distant wail of sirens grew louder, slicing through the tense air. Malik, still watching from the back seat, felt his heart stutter as his father approached the SUV. When Darren opened the door, the boy's small, trembling voice pierced the quiet. "Is it really over?" Darren paused, crouching slightly to meet his son's wide, searching eyes. For a moment, he was just a father again. The weight of his badge set aside. His voice, when he answered, was soft but steady, a lifeline in the storm. "For now, yeah. But we've got a long way to go, kid. Justice doesn't wrap up neat and tidy, it's a fight, every day. And I'm gonna keep fighting it, for you." Malik nodded slowly, clutching his sketchbook tighter. The faint outline of a hero taking shape in his mind, one who looked a lot like his dad. Behind them, Harper stood alone, a cautionary tale carved in the slump of his shoulders. A living lesson that power unchecked breeds ruin, while justice, though slow, demands its due. The air was thick with the lingering scent of gasoline and tension as Darren rested his hand gently on Malik's shoulder, his touch soft yet steady, like an anchor in a storm. "Not yet," he said. His voice calm but carrying a weight that hinted at hope, "but this is a step towards something better." Malik stood there, his breath uneven, his wide eyes flickering with uncertainty. He clutched his sketchbook tightly against his chest, as if it were a shield against the chaos swirling in his mind. "Do you think he'll ever change?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, laced with a mix of fear and longing for an answer that might ease his restless heart. Darren let out a slow, deliberate breath, his gaze drifting toward the horizon where the gas station's neon lights flickered faintly in the fading daylight. "That's up to him, son," he replied, his tone thoughtful, measured. "Change isn't easy, it demands courage, a willingness to own up to your mistakes. But whether he changes or not, that's not the heart of it. What matters more is ensuring people like him face the consequences of their actions. That's where justice begins." Malik nodded, his grip on the sketchbook loosening just a fraction. The tension in his fingers easing as his father's words settled over him. Darren gave his shoulder a firm, reassuring squeeze, a silent promise of support, before stepping toward the driver's side of the SUV. As the vehicle rolled out of the dusty lot, the gas station shrank in the rearview mirror, its harsh fluorescent glow swallowed by the encroaching dusk. Darren's eyes lingered on the scene for a heartbeat longer, the weight of the day pressing down on him like a heavy coat. Exhaustion etched lines into his face, but beneath it burned a quiet resolve, a fire that refused to be snuffed out. What had happened wasn't the end of the fight, but it was a victory. A small but undeniable taste of justice. For now, that was enough to keep him moving forward. The SUV wound its way through the city streets, tires humming against the asphalt. While Malik sat in the back seat, his head resting against the cool glass of the window. The tension from the gas station clung to him like a shadow, a tight knot twisting in his chest that refused to unravel completely. Outside, the familiar blur of streetlights and storefronts streaked by, but his eyes saw none of it. His mind was still trapped in that moment, the officer's raised voice, the heat of shame and fear washing over him, the way his body had locked up, powerless. Darren caught his son's reflection in the rearview mirror, the boy's silence speaking louder than words. Those sharp, perceptive eyes softened as he took in Malik's hunched shoulders and the way his fingers fidgeted with the edge of his sketchbook. The air between them grew heavy with unspoken questions. A fragile thread of connection stretched taut. "Malik," Darren said at last, his voice low and steady, cutting through the hum of the engine. "I know today was a lot to handle. If there's anything on your mind, anything you need to get off your chest, I'm right here." Malik didn't answer right away. His gaze remained fixed on the world outside. The passing scenery a blur of muted colors, grays and browns smeared with the occasional flash of neon. After a long, heavy pause, he turned his head just enough to meet his father's eyes in the mirror, his voice soft but trembling with emotion. "Why does it have to be like this, Dad? Why do people like him think they can treat us that way?" Darren's hands tightened on the steering wheel for a fleeting moment, his knuckles whitening before he forced himself to relax. He exhaled slowly, choosing his words with care, as if each one were a stone he was laying down to build something solid for his son to stand on. "There's no easy answer to that, Malik. Some people carry fear in their hearts, or hatred, and they let it steer them. It's wrong, and it's unfair, but it's the world we're in. The real fight is making sure it doesn't break us, making sure we rise above it." Malik's brow furrowed, his fingers pressing harder into the worn cover of his sketchbook. "But it did break me," he admitted, his voice cracking. "For a little while, it did. I felt so small, like I was nothing." The confession hit Darren like a punch to the chest. His son's raw vulnerability slicing through him. He pulled the SUV into an empty parking lot, the crunch of gravel under the tires filling the silence as he shifted into park. Turning in his seat, he faced Malik fully, his eyes locking onto his son's with an intensity that demanded attention. "Malik, listen to me," he said, his voice firm but thick with emotion. "What happened back there wasn't your fault. You didn't do a single thing wrong. That officer tried to strip you of your power, to make you feel less than you are, but he failed. You're still here. Still standing tall, and that's a strength he'll never comprehend." Tears welled in Malik's eyes, glistening but refusing to fall, as his voice shook. "But what if it happens again? What if next time it's worse?" Darren leaned forward, closing the distance between them, his gaze unwavering. "That's why we fight, Malik. That's why we stand up and demand accountability, so there are fewer next times, so the world becomes a little safer, not just for you, but for everyone. Justice isn't just a word. It's a shield we build together." Malik nodded slowly, though the doubt lingered in his expression like a stubborn stain. Darren reached out, his hand finding his son's shoulder again. Warm and steady. "And you're not in this alone. You've got me, your mom, and a whole community that's got your back. Together, we're unstoppable." Malik's eyes dropped to his sketchbook, his fingers tracing the faint outline of a drawing on the cover, a jagged, abstract shape he'd doodled weeks ago in a burst of frustration. When he spoke again, his voice was barely audible. A fragile thread of sound. "Do you think he regrets it? That officer?" Darren paused, the question hanging in the air like smoke. He leaned back slightly, his brow creasing as he considered it. "Maybe he does, in his own twisted way. Maybe he regrets getting caught more than the hurt he caused. Or maybe, just maybe, he's starting to see the damage he's done. But regret's a hollow thing. Malik, it doesn't fix what's broken. It's what he does with that regret that counts, and that's out of our hands." Malik chewed on his father's words, his expression shifting from confusion to quiet contemplation. Darren offered a small, encouraging smile, a flicker of warmth breaking through the heaviness, before turning back to the wheel. The SUV hummed back to life, pulling out of the lot and weaving through the city once more. The silence that followed wasn't as suffocating as before. Malik seemed lighter. As if the conversation had chipped away at the burden he'd been carrying. The knot in his chest loosened, if only a little, and the world outside the window began to feel less hostile. When they pulled into the driveway, the soft glow of the porch light welcomed them home. Malik climbed out of the SUV, his sneakers scuffing against the pavement as he followed Darren to the front door. Inside, the familiar scent of home enveloped them, warm and comforting. Laced with the faint promise of the lasagna Darren had sworn he'd cook that night. Malik set his sketchbook down on the coffee table with a quiet thud and sank into the couch, his body finally relaxing into the cushions. His gaze drifted, distant but calmer, the storm in his mind beginning to settle. In the kitchen, Darren moved with the ease of habit. Pulling out ingredients, tomatoes, garlic, a block of cheese, his hands steady as he began to chop. The rhythmic thud of the knife against the cutting board grounded him. Each slice a small act of reclaiming normalcy after the chaos of the day. From the living room, Malik's voice floated in, tentative but curious. "Dad, do you think people can change? Like, really change, even if they've done awful things?" Darren paused, the knife hovering mid-air, a half-chopped onion forgotten on the board. He turned to face his son, his expression softening as he crossed the room to sit beside him on the couch. "I think they can," he said slowly, resting his hands on his knees. "But it's a hard road, Malik. It takes more than just wanting it, it takes facing the ugly truth about yourself, owning up to the pain you've caused, and working every day to be better. Not everyone's got that kind of grit." Malik frowned, his fingers idly flipping through the pages of his sketchbook, past sketches of superheroes and cityscapes he'd poured his heart into. "Do you think he will?" he asked, his voice tinged with a fragile hope. Darren sighed, leaning back against the couch. "I don't know, son. That's his battle, not ours. What I do know is we can't let his choices define who we are. We keep pushing forward, no matter what he does." Malik looked up, his dark eyes searching his father's face. "You're not mad at me, are you? For not saying anything when he yelled at me?" I just froze. The question twisted something deep in Darren's chest, and he shook his head fiercely. "Malik, no. Never. Freezing doesn't make you weak, it's just what happens when fear hits hard. You've got nothing to be ashamed of. You're safe now, and you held your ground in your own way. That's what counts." The room fell quiet again, but it was a softer silence. One filled with understanding rather than strain. Outside, the city buzzed on. Oblivious to the small victory unfolding within these walls, a father and son piecing together resilience from the shards of a hard day. Justice had been served, not as a grand finale, but as a stepping stone, a reminder that power misused carries a cost, and that cost would ripple outward, demanding accountability. For Malik, it was a lesson etched into his bones. The world could be cruel, but it couldn't break him, not when he had his father's steady hand, a community's strength, and the quiet fire of his own spirit to carry him through. In the cozy glow of their modest kitchen, Malik let his shoulders slump, the tension that had gripped him all day easing just a fraction as he stood beside his father. Darren, with a tender grin lighting up his weathered face, reached over and tousled Malik's dark curls, his touch gentle yet brimming with unspoken pride. "Always, kiddo," he murmured, his voice a warm anchor in the storm of the day. "How about we tackle this lasagna together? I'd say we've earned ourselves a hearty meal tonight." For the first time since the sun had risen. Malik's lips curved into a small, authentic smile, a flicker of light that pierced Darren's chest with a quiet, aching joy. Side by side, they shuffled into the kitchen. The clatter of pots and the rich aroma of tomato sauce gradually washing away the heaviness that had clung to them. Darren understood that the road ahead was still riddled with obstacles. But in this fleeting pocket of calm, he found solace. It was a fragile, precious reminder of why he pressed on, why he'd never relent until the world bent toward fairness for his son. This wasn't just about survival, it was about justice, about ensuring that power, when wielded, lifted rather than crushed. The weeks that followed unfurled like a tempest, sweeping change far beyond the cracked asphalt of the gas station parking lot where it all began. Internal affairs descended with a meticulous fury, their investigation slicing through the murky layers of Officer Harper's actions. What they uncovered wasn't just the ugly truth of his confrontation with Malik, a moment seared into the boy's mind with the sting of humiliation, but a sprawling ledger of grievances from a community long ignored. The evidence piled high, each complaint a testament to years of arrogance unchecked, and Harper's resignation came swiftly. A hollow gesture that couldn't mend the wounds he'd carved into the lives he'd sworn to protect. For Darren, now chief of police, this was merely the first domino to fall. Holding one man accountable felt like brushing a speck of dust from a crumbling wall. He knew the rot ran deep, festering in the systems that had shielded men like Harper for too long. With a fire in his gut, he rolled out reforms: mandatory bias training to uproot the seeds of prejudice, an independent review board to shine a light on shadowed complaints, and monthly gatherings where community voices, raw, trembling, or resolute, could finally be heard. These weren't cures, not yet, but they were steps, deliberate and unyielding. Darren's resolve hardened. He'd spent years building this department, and he'd be damned if it slipped back into apathy. His officers began to see him not just as a leader but as a man who demanded fairness with a quiet, steely grace, while the community's respect blossomed, tentative but growing. For Malik, life stitched itself back together thread by thread, though the echo of that day lingered like a bruise beneath his skin. His sketchbook, once a playground of wild dreams and fantastical creatures, transformed into a canvas of truth. One page bore the towering figure of his father, broad-shouldered and unbowed, a guardian etched in bold, protective strokes. Another captured the gas station in jagged, heavy lines, the harsh glare of headlights, the looming shadow of Harper, the weight of fear pressing down. Hesitantly, Malik began to share these drawings. His pencil tracing paths his voice couldn't yet follow. To his surprise, they struck chords with others, friends, neighbors, even strangers, who saw their own stories reflected in the stark ink. At just 14, he'd stumbled into a quiet power, his art igniting whispers and then shouts about bias, accountability, and the slow grind of justice. It wasn't loud or brash, but it carried a weight far beyond his years, a testament to how even the smallest hands can shift the tide. Meanwhile, Harper's world collapsed inward, an implosion as swift as it was inevitable. Stripped of his badge, his name now a stain in the public eye, he wandered the streets he'd once patrolled with a hollow swagger. Job applications vanished into silence. And old colleagues turned their backs, their eyes averted from the scandal's fallout. Alone in a cramped apartment, the walls seemed to close in. Each creak of the floorboards a mocking echo of the life he'd squandered. For the first time, Harper faced the mirror of his own making, no excuses, no uniform to hide behind. Counseling became his reluctant lifeline, not because he had to, but because the wreckage of his arrogance stared back at him, unblinking. Could he change? The question gnawed at him, unanswered. As the cracks in his once impenetrable pride widened, letting slivers of doubt seep through. Darren and Malik, though, grew closer, their bond tempered by the fire they'd walked through. Darren had always been there, steady, present, but now he doubled down, acutely aware that Malik needed to know he wasn't facing the world alone. One evening, as the kitchen table groaned under the weight of scattered sketchpads and half-empty coffee mugs, Malik slid a drawing across to his father. It depicted a superhero, cape billowing, fists planted on hips, victorious, and the silhouette was unmistakably Darren's. A low chuckle rumbled from Darren's chest, warm and thick with emotion. "I don't know if I can measure up to that, kid." Malik's eyes sparkled, his smile wide and unguarded. "You already do, Dad." That moment, simple yet profound, was a balm to them both, a quiet victory amid the chaos. Beyond their home, the community stirred, roused by the ripples of Darren's leadership. Local shop owners, their storefronts weathered but defiant, opened their doors for workshops on racial equity. Voices rising in earnest debate. Schools wove lessons on implicit bias into their classrooms, young minds grappling with questions older than their years. Grassroots groups swelled, their meetings buzzing with purpose and possibility. Darren often brought Malik along, his son's presence a silent lesson in courage and unity. What had started as a single, painful clash had ignited something fierce, a collective push for change, a refusal to let injustice settle into silence. It was messy, imperfect, but alive. Months later, on a still evening, Darren stood in his office, the city skyline a mosaic of amber and shadow beyond the wide window. His desk was a battlefield of progress, reports from the review board, scribbled notes from community forums, a half-cold cup of coffee abandoned in the fray. He leaned back, exhaling a slow, weary breath, when his phone hummed against the wood. A text from Malik glowed on the screen, "Dinner's ready. Don't make me eat alone." A tired smile tugged at Darren's lips, his heart swelling as he gathered his coat and keys. Home called, and with it, the promise of a moment's peace. This wasn't just a tale of a single day's clash in a dimly lit parking lot, it was about the aftershocks, the waves that crashed and reshaped everything they touched. Darren's fight wasn't for punishment alone but for a foundation where trust could take root, where power served rather than prayed. Malik's quiet resilience proved that even fear couldn't silence a spirit determined to heal, to create. Together, they showed that justice isn't a thunderclap, it's a slow, stubborn bloom, born from courage and nurtured by consequence. When power oversteps, it doesn't just harm, it fractures trust, and repairing that takes more than apologies, it demands action, accountability, and a willingness to listen. Their story whispers a challenge, to stand firm, to speak out, to build something better from the ashes of what's broken. The night was heavy with silence as David cruised through the desolate streets, the hum of his engine the only sound cutting through the stillness. The people who lived here were nothing more than a collection of failures in his eyes, shiftless, reckless souls who pointed fingers at the world instead of owning their messes. His grip tightened on the steering wheel, frustration simmering beneath his skin as he passed a shuttered convenience store, its windows dark and lifeless. Then, out of the corner of his eye, a figure snagged his attention, pulling him out of his brooding thoughts. There she stood, an elderly black woman, fragile as a whisper, leaning heavily on a cane beside the store's locked door. A wide-brimmed hat cast a shadow over her face, hiding most of it from view, while a flimsy plastic bag dangled from her free hand. She looked out of place. Too old and too frail to be lingering in the dead of night. Suspicion flared in David's chest like a match struck against dry wood. Who was she? Another vagrant, probably. Or worse, a junkie looking for a fix. His mind raced with the same tired assumptions he'd carried for years, prejudices that had calcified into something he no longer questioned. Perfect, he thought bitterly. Just the excuse he needed to flex his authority. With a sharp jerk, he slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as he swung the car to the curb. The jolt of the stop mirrored the surge of irritation pulsing through him. One quick lesson, that's all it would take. She'd learn not to loiter around here at this hour, not on his watch. He threw the door open and stepped out, his boots striking the pavement with a resounding thud that echoed in the empty street. Each step toward her was deliberate. A slow march fueled by the certainty of his power. He expected her to shrink away, to cower like most did when they saw the uniform, the badge, the white face behind it. But she didn't. She didn't even flinch. That defiance, her refusal to tremble, only stoked the fire in David's gut. "Hey," he barked, his voice ripping through the quiet night like a blade slashing fabric. The woman turned her head slowly, deliberately, as if she had all the time in the world. Beneath the brim of her hat, her eyes glinted faintly in the streetlight, steady and unafraid. There was no panic in her posture, no hurried excuses tumbling from her lips. She stood there, rooted to the spot, her stillness a quiet challenge that made David's blood boil hotter. "What are you doing out here this late?" he demanded, stepping closer, his tone dripping with menace. "Looking for something to steal?" He didn't care what she said. He didn't want an answer, he wanted her to break, to grovel, to give him the satisfaction of seeing her fear. But instead, her brow creased slightly, and her gaze turned cold, piercing through him like a winter wind. "I'm not doing anything wrong," she replied, her voice soft but unyielding, a thread of steel woven through it. "I'm just on my way home." "Home?" David sneered, his lips curling as anger flashed in his eyes. "People like you don't just wander out here at this hour, going home." He lunged forward and snatched the plastic bag from her grip, the force sending a few small boxes of food tumbling to the cracked pavement. She didn't gasp or protest. She just watched him, her expression unchanged, her calm like a slap across his face. That unshakable composure, it mocked him, unraveled him. "Who the hell do you think you are?" he roared, his pride swelling alongside his rage. He closed the distance between them, towering over her, the air thick with his intimidation. "You know who you're talking to? I'm a cop. I'm the one in charge here." His face was inches from hers now, his breath hot and ragged, but she didn't budge. Her silence poured fuel on the inferno raging inside him. "Damn it," he spat, raising his hand, ready to shove her, to shatter that infuriating serenity. But before his palm could connect, a voice, soft, almost fragile, cut through the tension. "You don't know what you're doing." The words froze his arm mid-swing, a shiver of unease prickling at the edges of his fury. Something felt wrong, off-kilter, but his anger was a blinding fog, drowning out any flicker of doubt. Without a second thought, he swung his fist, aiming to crush her defiance into dust. She didn't crumple. Instead, she stepped back with a grace that belied her age, gripping her cane tighter as she straightened to her full height. Then, in a motion so calm it felt surreal, she reached into her coat and pulled out a small leather wallet. With a flick of her wrist, she flipped it open, and the glint of an FBI badge caught the dim streetlight, shining like a beacon of reckoning. "You've made a big mistake, David Brown," she said, her voice still quiet but now laced with an authority that hit him like a thunderclap. "I'm Special Agent Louise Thompson with the FBI. And you're going to pay for this." David's world tilted. His fists clenched at his sides, but his body locked in place, ice creeping through his veins. The badge gleamed in her hand, a symbol of everything he'd misjudged, everything he'd miscalculated. His breath caught in his throat as the weight of her words sank in, dragging him into a pit of dread. How could this be? This frail, elderly black woman, someone he'd pegged as a nobody, a homeless drifter, was an FBI agent? His mind rebelled against the idea, clawing for denial. "You've got to be kidding me," he shouted, his voice cracking with a mix of disbelief and fury. "FBI? An FBI agent wandering around at night like some damn beggar?" He stared at her, his hand trembling, not from cold, but from the rage still pulsing through him. Louise didn't waver. She held the badge steady, her eyes locked on his, cutting through his bluster with a quiet intensity that made his skin crawl. She saw him, truly saw him, and it unnerved him more than any threat ever could. "You think I'm joking?" she said, her voice still gentle but edged with a sharpness that sliced through his bravado. "I've been watching you, David. You and your little crew of cops, the power trips, the racism, the abuses. I'm not here by accident. I'm here to bring it all down." "Shut up." David exploded, his rage erupting like a volcano, molten and uncontrollable. "You think you can come here and ruin me? You think you, a black, old woman, can do that to me?" The words spilled out, venomous and raw, each one steeped in the hatred that had festered in him for years. It wasn't just that she was FBI. It was that she, a black woman, dared to stand against him, a white cop, and strip away the control he clung to like a lifeline. His chest heaved. His eyes wild with the desperation of a man watching his world slip through his fingers. "I don't care who you are," he bellowed, his face flushed red. "This is my turf. I'll make you pay. You old hag." He raised his hand again, this time with lethal intent, his muscles coiled to strike. But Louise's voice cut through once more, colder now, sharper, a blade honed to perfection. "You're playing with fire, David. Do you even know who's watching you right now? They're coming. Right now." The words landed like a sledgehammer, knocking the breath from his lungs. "Who?" he shouted, confusion tangling with his fury. "Who's watching?" A sliver of fear wormed its way into his chest, sharp and unfamiliar, but his ego refused to let him back down. "Don't mess with me." "FBI," Louise said, her tone steady as granite, her gaze unshaken. "They've been watching you for months. We have everything, every abuse, every racist word. Every dirty power play you and your crew have pulled." The air around David thickened, pressing in on him like a trap snapping shut. He felt it, the noose tightening. The walls closing in, but his pride wouldn't let him surrender. "I don't care about the FBI or anyone else," he roared, his voice a feral growl. "You're just a black woman, and I'm the cop. I'll show you what real power is." He lunged at her, arms outstretched, ready to crush her defiance beneath his fists. But in that moment, the distant wail of sirens pierced the night. Growing louder, closer. Headlights flashed around the corner, and the reality of his downfall crashed over him like a tidal wave. Louise stepped back. Her cane tapping the pavement with a quiet rhythm, her eyes never leaving his. "Justice doesn't bend to bullies, David," she said softly, her words carrying the weight of inevitability. "And power built on hate always crumbles." David stood there, chest heaving, his world unraveling thread by thread. The elderly woman he dismissed as powerless had turned the tables, exposing the rot beneath his badge. Around him, the night pulsed with the consequences of his actions, sirens, lights, the inescapable truth. He'd abused his authority, wielded it like a weapon against those he deemed beneath him, and now the reckoning had arrived. Louise's calm strength, her unwavering resolve, stood as a testament to a deeper justice, one that didn't bow to his rage or his title. And as the first car screeched to a halt behind him, David knew, with a sinking certainty, that the lesson he'd meant to teach had been turned back on him, sharper and more enduring than he could ever have imagined. The night air hung thick and heavy, charged with an electric tension that seemed to ripple through the empty street. David stood there, his chest puffed out, shoulders squared, his hands twitching with the urge to assert his dominance. He glared down at Louise, a frail-looking black woman whose quiet defiance gnawed at him like an itch he couldn't scratch. In his mind, she was nothing, just another person to be put in her place. Another opportunity to prove who really held the reins. He imagined her crumbling beneath his authority, her knees buckling as she bowed to the power he wielded like a scepter. His lips curled into a sneer, and he took a step forward, his hand rising with deliberate intent. But before he could close the distance between them, a sharp sound sliced through the stillness, a low rumble that grew into the roar of engines piercing the night. David's head whipped around, his pulse quickening as his eyes darted toward the source. Under the flickering glow of the streetlights, two black SUVs rolled into view, their tires grinding against the cracked pavement. The vehicles came to a halt with a precision that sent a chill racing down his spine. Doors flung open, and out stepped a group of FBI agents clad in dark tactical gear. Their movements swift and synchronized. The glint of drawn guns caught the dim light, each barrel trained directly on him. Time seemed to slow as the world he'd built, brick by brick, with every flex of his badge, crumbled in an instant. His breath hitched, ragged and uneven, as the realization crashed over him like a tidal wave. There was no way out. Louise stood motionless, her gaze locking onto his. For a fleeting moment, a flicker of pity softened her eyes, but it was quickly overshadowed by an unshakable resolve. She didn't flinch, didn't waver. "You went too far, David," she said, her voice steady and cutting, a blade honed by years of silent strength. "Now you're going to pay." The words landed like a hammer against his chest, shattering the fragile shell of his bravado. His arms fell limp at his sides, his mind a chaotic storm of disbelief and dread. The agents closed in, their boots thudding against the asphalt. And before he could process the moment, cold steel snapped around his wrists. The handcuffs bit into his skin, a stark and humiliating reminder of his fall. This was no longer the street he'd swaggered through as a white cop, untouchable and feared. This was a nightmare unfurling in real time, one he'd never dared to imagine. As the agents tugged him toward the waiting SUV, Louise's voice echoed in his ears, sharp and unrelenting. "You're not the only one who will pay, David. This is just the beginning." He didn't respond, couldn't. His eyes stared ahead, unfocused, lost in a haze of shock. The chill of the cuffs seeped into his bones, a physical echo of the terror sinking deeper with every step. This wasn't just an arrest, it was the opening chapter of a reckoning far worse than anything he'd ever conjured in his darkest moments. Later, in the holding cell, David slumped on the edge of a steel bed, its surface as unforgiving as the reality now closing in around him. The dim bulb overhead buzzed faintly, casting jagged shadows across the bare concrete walls. His mind churned, a whirlwind of fragmented memories and fractured pride. Every ounce of his identity had been forged in the fire of his police career, a career defined by the belief that he was invincible. The uniform had been his armor, the badge his crown, the gun his scepter. With them, he'd ruled the streets, bending others to his will, especially the black residents he'd long dismissed as lesser. He'd reveled in their fear, fed off their submission, using his authority to crush anyone who dared defy him. That power had felt eternal, a birthright he'd never questioned, until now. But that illusion was unraveling, thread by thread, leaving him exposed and raw. Each piece of his arrogance splintered and fell, replaced by a gnawing fear that clawed at his insides. How could this happen? How could she, a black woman he'd dismissed as weak, insignificant, bring him to his knees? Louise, with her slight frame and unassuming presence, had toppled him from the pedestal he'd built. The irony burned like acid in his throat. He, a white cop dripping with authority, now sat caged in a cell, powerless and small. The creak of the cell door jolted him from his spiraling thoughts. He looked up, his heart thudding painfully against his ribs, as Louise stepped inside. Gone was the fragile old woman he'd first encountered. In her place stood a figure of quiet, commanding strength, an FBI agent whose presence filled the room like a storm cloud. Her eyes, sharp and unyielding, cut through him like a blade, stripping away the last vestiges of his defiance. In her hands, she held the weight of his undoing, evidence meticulously gathered, a ledger of every sin he'd committed under the guise of duty. "You know what's coming, don't you?" Her voice sliced through the stifling silence, calm but laced with an edge that made his skin prickle. "You've gone too far, David. It's time to answer for everything, every wrong, every abuse, every life you've trampled." Her words weren't just an accusation, they were a verdict, delivered with the certainty of someone who'd seen justice delayed but never denied. David's chest heaved as a primal growl rumbled up from deep within. "You can't touch me," he snarled, his voice thick with desperation. "You're just an old black woman, no one gives a damn about you. I'm a cop. I've put away plenty of your kind." He forced a sneer, clinging to the tattered remnants of his confidence, but inside, he was coming apart at the seams. His heart raced. His palms slick with sweat, betraying the fear he refused to acknowledge. Louise didn't flinch. She stood there, unflappable, her piercing gaze dismantling his bravado with surgical precision. "You still don't understand, do you?" she said, her tone steady as granite. "You think you're untouchable, above the law. But you're wrong. I've been watching you for months, every move. Every act of violence, every racist word you've spat. We have it all. Your power? It's gone. And now it's going to cost you everything." Her words struck like a thunderclap. And David's teeth ground together as he fought to hold on to the last scraps of his pride. "I don't care what you say," he shouted, his voice cracking with rage. "I don't regret a damn thing. I'm a cop, it's my job. Those black people in this neighborhood? They need to know their place, and I was just doing what had to be done." His fists clenched, the cuffs rattling against his wrists. A futile gesture of defiance in a battle he'd already lost. Louise watched him, her expression serene yet unyielding, like a judge peering into the soul of a condemned man. "You think you can brutalize people without consequence," she said softly, almost mournfully. "You think black lives are yours to crush, that your badge gives you the right to play God. But you're mistaken, David. Justice doesn't bend to your will. And now, it's here to collect." The air in the room grew thick, the tension coiling tighter until it snapped. David lunged from the bed. A roar tearing from his throat as he threw himself at her, desperate to reclaim some shred of control. But the handcuffs jerked him back, and two agents materialized from the shadows behind Louise. Their hands firm and unyielding as they forced him down. "I'm not afraid of you," he bellowed, his voice wild and unhinged, echoing off the concrete walls. "You'll never break me, damn it." Louise's lips curved into a faint, frigid smile, not of triumph, but of pity for a man too blind to see his own ruin. "You're not in charge anymore, David," she said. Her voice a quiet blade slipping between his ribs. "You're not the cop who terrifies people into submission. You're just a criminal now, and no one's coming to save you." The words pierced him deeper than any weapon could, and the fight drained from his body like water through a sieve. He sank back onto the bed, his breath shallow, his eyes hollow as the truth settled over him, his power. His identity, everything he'd clung to was slipping through his fingers. The cell grew silent, save for the faint hum of the bulb above. David stared at the ceiling, its cracks mirroring the fractures in his mind. The shadows on the walls danced like specters, mocking the man he'd once been, a figure of authority, feared and revered. He'd walked these streets every day, basking in the deference of those he passed, savoring the terror in the eyes of the black residents he'd loathed. That power had been his lifeblood. A drug he'd never thought he'd lose. But now, stripped bare, he was the one trembling, the one cowering beneath the weight of his own choices. Sleep eluded him in the days that followed. Each time his eyes drifted shut, nightmares clawed their way in, faces of those he'd wronged staring back at him, their silent accusations louder than any scream. The beatings he'd doled out with a smirk, the slurs he'd hurled with glee, they haunted him now, ghosts of his own making. His cell became a prison within a prison. The walls closing in as his once impenetrable ego eroded. But what terrified him most wasn't the bars or the cuffs. It was Lieutenant John Harper. Harper wasn't just a name. He was a shadow that loomed over David's every thought. The head of the corrupt network David had served, Harper was a man of cold, calculated ruthlessness, a predator who tolerated no betrayal. For years, Harper had been David's shield, his mentor, the one who'd turned a blind eye to the violence and racism as long as it served their ends. But now, with David in custody, that protection felt like a noose tightening around his neck. If he spoke, if he named Harper to save himself, He knew the consequences would be swift and merciless. Harper didn't forgive, he erased. One restless night, as David lay on the steel bed, the cell door groaned open again. His heart leapt into his throat, expecting Louise or another agent. But the figure that stepped inside was shrouded in darkness, the dim light barely catching the edge of a familiar silhouette. It wasn't Louise, it was someone else, someone tied to Harper. Perhaps a warning or a promise of what was to come. The air grew colder, and David's mind raced with a new kind of fear. Justice had caught him, yes. But the consequences of his abuse of power stretched far beyond these walls. Louise had been right, this was only the beginning. In that moment, the lesson sank deep into his bones. Power, when wielded as a weapon against the innocent, was a fragile thing, built on sand, destined to collapse. Justice, though slow, was relentless, a force that bowed to no badge or gun. And for David, the price of his arrogance was a life unraveling thread by thread, with no end to the torment in sight. The rusted metal door screeched as it swung open, its groan reverberating through the dim, suffocating room like an ominous prelude. A man stepped inside, his silhouette slicing through the faint light that dared to spill in from the hallway. His face was a mask of ice, unyielding, emotionless, save for the eyes, which glinted with a sharpness that cut straight into David's soul. They weren't just cold, they were a silent threat, a predator's stare that pinned David to his chair. "Harper sends his regards," the man whispered, his voice low and laced with a sinister chill that slithered down David's spine, turning his blood to frost. Before David could muster a word, a breath, or even a flinch, the man vanished, melting back into the shadows as though he'd never been there. David sat frozen, the darkness pressing in around him. His chest tight with a heartbeat that thundered like a war drum. Panic clawed its way up his throat, a wild, desperate thing he couldn't swallow down. Those words, "Harper sends his regards," echoed in his skull, each repetition tightening the noose of dread around his neck. Harper knew. Harper always knew. And that knowledge carried the weight of a death sentence. David's mind spiraled, a storm of fear and realization crashing through him. He could picture Harper now, his square jaw set, his calculating eyes narrowing as he weighed every potential betrayal. Harper wasn't just a man, he was a force, a kingpin of power who ruled their corrupt little world with an iron fist. David had seen it firsthand, the way Harper silenced dissent, crushed threats, and buried secrets so deep they'd never see daylight. If Harper suspected David might spill their dirty truths to the FBI, then David was already a dead man walking. Cooperation with the feds would sign his execution order, Harper wouldn't hesitate to have him snuffed out before a single syllable left his lips. But staying silent wasn't salvation either. The evidence was piling up, the walls closing in. If he didn't talk, the law would bury him anyway, years behind bars, his career in ashes, his life stripped to nothing. Either path led to ruin. His hands trembled as he gripped the arms of his chair, the cold metal biting into his palms. Power had once been his shield, his pride, his fortress. Now, it was a blade at his throat, wielded by the very man he'd served. Days bled into nights, each one heavier than the last. The FBI interrogation room became David's prison. Its gray walls and flickering fluorescent lights a relentless backdrop to his unraveling. Agent Louise sat across from him, her presence steady but suffocating, her questions relentless. Every word she spoke was a scalpel, slicing through the fragile armor of his self-respect. "David," she said one afternoon, her voice calm yet weighted with an unspoken gravity. "You know Harper won't let you walk away from this. Your options are running out." She leaned forward slightly, her dark eyes locking onto his, unyielding. "Do you really think he'll let you live if you don't cooperate? Harper's empire is cracking, and he'll throw you under the rubble to save himself. You're expendable to him. David's mouth went dry. His tongue a useless lump. He couldn't argue, she was right. Harper's loyalty was a myth, a fairy tale David had told himself to justify the blood on his hands. The truth gnawed at him. He was caught between two merciless forces. Harper, with his ruthless grip on power, would kill to protect it. Louise, with her quiet determination, had already peeled back the layers of filth David had buried, crimes he'd convinced himself were just part of the job. His head sank. His shaking hands folding into fists as the weight of his reality crushed him. He'd spent years basking in the glow of authority, believing it made him untouchable. Now, that same power was a noose tightening with every breath. Harper wouldn't just deal with him, he'd erase him, leave no trace, no memory. But Louise? She already had enough, files, witnesses, recordings, to ensure David couldn't slink away unscathed. The room felt smaller, the air thicker, as the inevitability sank in. There was no escape, no clever twist to save him. Only a choice. Die by Harper's hand or face the consequences of his own making. It was early morning when the decision came, the weak sunlight filtering through the grimy window like a reluctant witness. David's throat burned as he rasped, "Okay, I'll talk." The words stumbled out, raw and jagged, a confession torn from the depths of his fear. He lifted his gaze to meet Louise's. His eyes wide with terror and a flicker of desperation. "But I need protection. Harper will kill me if he finds out. He'll know the second I open my mouth." Louise didn't blink, didn't flinch. She gave a small, measured nod, her piercing stare unwavering. "You'll get protection," she said, her tone firm but not unkind, "but only if you give us everything. No half-truths, no holding back. Harper and the whole rotten department, they need to be laid bare." David inhaled deeply, the air heavy in his lungs, a suffocating reminder of the line he was about to cross. Once he started, there'd be no retreat. He'd be a traitor, a pariah to the men who'd once slapped his back and shared his sins. But what choice did he have? He'd built this trap alongside Harper. Brick by bloody brick, and now it had sprung shut around him. From that moment, David's life veered onto a jagged, uncharted path. He began feeding the FBI fragments of the empire he'd helped construct, names, dates, deals. He spoke of Harper's reign, how he'd smothered evidence of brutality, shielded guilty officers, and turned a blind eye to murders that never made the reports. Each word painted a grotesque portrait of a police force where power wasn't just abused, it was a weapon, honed to crush the weak. The voiceless, the vulnerable. David's voice trembled as he recounted it all, the memories clawing at him. He saw the faces of the people he'd beaten, the lives he'd shattered. All under Harper's approving nod. The interrogation room grew colder with every revelation, the sweat soaking his shirt a testament to the guilt he could no longer outrun. Harper, meanwhile, wasn't idle. He sensed the noose tightening, the whispers of betrayal seeping through his ranks. In his dimly lit office, surrounded by files and the stale smell of cigarette smoke, he moved like a cornered animal. He shredded documents, his thick fingers trembling with a mix of rage and fear. He leaned on his loyal lieutenants, men like Officer Daniels, a wiry figure with a nervous laugh who'd always been eager to please, and Sergeant Mills, a hulking brute whose silence was more menacing than words. Harper barked orders, his voice a low growl. "Keep your mouths shut. They've got nothing unless someone talks." But the FBI already had leads, threads David had unwittingly handed them, and the net was closing. Louise and her team burned the midnight oil, piecing together a case that would dismantle Harper's kingdom brick by brick. As David's testimony deepened, the scope of the corruption unfurled like a nightmare. It wasn't just Harper, it was a web of rot stretching from beat cops to brass, steeped in racial venom. Black communities had borne the brunt. Not just through fists and batons but through quieter cruelties, ignored complaints, fabricated charges, lives erased from the record. David sat in that stark room. The damp chill seeping into his bones, recounting it all. He remembered the nights he'd slammed a young black man against a wall, the crunch of bone under his knuckles. The slurs he'd spat without a second thought. He'd told himself it was justice, that they were criminals by nature. Now, with Louise's steady gaze boring into him, he saw the truth. He'd been a cog in a machine built to oppress, fueled by his own hatred. Louise never wavered, her composure a quiet storm. "Do you realize what you've done, David?" she asked one day. Her voice soft but razor-sharp. This wasn't just Harper. It was a system, a machine you helped run. You didn't just follow orders, you fed it, built it, with every black life you crushed. David's breath hitched, his eyes dropping to the scarred tabletop. He'd worn his badge like a crown, but now it was a brand, marking him as an oppressor. The weight of it, every arrest, every blow, every lie, crashed over him. "We've got enough to take down Harper and half the department," Louise continued, "but we need more. Every detail, every name." Her words weren't a plea, they were a command, and David obeyed, spilling the last of his secrets into the void. Justice, he realized too late, wasn't a shield for men like him, it was a mirror, reflecting the ugliness he'd nurtured. Harper's fall was coming, but David's punishment had already begun, a life stripped bare, haunted by the consequences of power abused. The lesson seared into him: wield authority without mercy, and it will turn, devouring you in the end. The air in the interrogation room hung heavy, thick with the weight of unspoken truths and the faint hum of a flickering fluorescent light overhead. David sat slumped in a metal chair. His shoulders hunched as if the burden of his past pressed down on him like a physical force. His bloodshot eyes, rimmed with exhaustion and sleepless nights, darted nervously around the room before settling on Louise, who sat across from him, her pen poised above a notepad. Her posture was steady, her gaze unflinching. A quiet storm of resolve brewing beneath her calm exterior. The silence between them stretched taut, a fragile thread ready to snap under the strain of what was about to unfold. David's voice, when it finally emerged, was brittle, trembling with the cracks of a man whose world had unraveled. "I wasn't the only one," he said, his words spilling out like shards of broken glass. "Harper, he was the one steering it all, the ringleader, but there were others, plenty of us. We weren't just following orders, we were eager to carry them out." His hands, resting on the table, shook uncontrollably, the knuckles widening as he clenched his fists to steady himself. "He told us to keep the black neighborhoods in line. That's what he called it, keeping them in line. If there was even a whisper of trouble, a shadow of suspicion, we didn't need proof. We acted instantly. No questions, no hesitation." Louise tilted her head slightly, her eyebrow arching as she scribbled notes, her movements deliberate and measured. The scratching of her pen against the paper was the only sound for a moment. A quiet counterpoint to David's faltering confession. "And what did you do with that kind of power?" she asked, her voice low but piercing, cutting through the haze of his guilt like a blade. She didn't look up from her writing, but her tone demanded an answer, leaving no room for evasion. David swallowed hard, the lump in his throat bobbing as he fought to get the words out. His mouth felt dry, his tongue heavy, as if his body itself resisted admitting the truth. We beat them," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper, barely audible over the hum of the light. "We'd drag them in, question them for no reason at all, just because we could. We'd lock them up, hold them without a shred of real evidence. Sometimes," he paused, his breath hitching as a memory clawed its way to the surface. "Sometimes, just seeing a black guy walking through a white neighborhood was enough. That was our excuse. We'd cuff them. Throw them in the back of the car, and Harper, he'd always say they couldn't be trusted. Called them a potential threat, like it was some kind of official warning. And we believed him. I believed him. The room seemed to shrink around them, the walls pressing in as David's words painted a vivid, ugly picture of the past. Outside, the world carried on, cars rumbling down the street. Distant voices filtering through the precinct windows, but inside, time felt suspended, trapped in the gravity of his confession. Louise set her pen down, letting the silence settle like dust after a storm. Her eyes met his, sharp and unyielding, but there was no trace of the anger or disgust he'd braced himself for. Instead, her calm unnerved him more than any outburst could have. It was a mirror, reflecting the monstrous weight of what he'd done without offering him the comfort of judgment. Out in the precinct, beyond the confines of that stifling room, Lieutenant John Harper was scrambling. The once arrogant man, who'd strutted through the department like a king, was now a cornered animal. His empire of control crumbling beneath the weight of an FBI investigation. Word had spread like wildfire through the ranks, whispers in the break room, sidelong glances in the hallways, and Harper felt the noose tightening. He'd spent years building a network of loyal officers, men like David who'd carried out his orders without question. But now those same men were turning away, their allegiance dissolving as the feds closed in. Desperate, Harper had reached out to his allies in the system. His voice low and urgent over late-night phone calls. He'd dangled bribes, hissed threats, anything to slow the investigation's relentless march. But the FBI had too much, too many leads. Too many cracks in his carefully constructed facade. The raid came at dawn, a sudden and merciless strike that shattered the stillness of Harper's suburban home. He'd been asleep, sprawled across his king-sized bed, when the door crashed open, splintering wood and jolting him upright. His heart pounded in his chest as flashlight beams cut through the darkness, illuminating the panicked lines of his face. Gone was the swagger, the unshakable confidence that had defined him. In its place was a man stripped bare, vulnerable and small. Rough hands yanked him from the sheets, his bare feet stumbling against the cold hardwood floor as agents barked orders. The cuffs snapped around his wrists with a sharp, metallic click. And as they dragged him toward the waiting car, he twisted his head back, defiance flickering in his eyes like a dying ember. "You can lock me up," he spat at the agents, his voice hoarse but steady. "But this system? It's bigger than me. You'll never tear it down." Louise watched from a distance, her arms crossed, her face a mask of quiet resolve. The morning air was crisp. The sky streaked with the first light of day, but she felt no triumph in Harper's fall. He wasn't wrong, not entirely. The corruption he'd nurtured was a hydra, its head stretching far beyond one man. Woven deep into the fabric of the institution he'd served. Arresting him was a victory, but it was only a single thread pulled from a tangled web. She turned away from the scene, her footsteps echoing on the pavement as she headed back to David. Later, in the dim light of the interrogation room, she faced him again. "We don't need to destroy it," she said. Her voice firm but tinged with a quiet hope that surprised even her. "We'll dismantle it, piece by piece, starting with people like you and Harper." David didn't respond, his head bowed. His hands clasped tightly in his lap. The weight of his betrayal, of Harper, of the system, of himself, pressed down on him, a suffocating force he couldn't shake. He'd crossed a line there was no coming back from, and now he had to live with the wreckage of his choices. But he also knew the machine he'd helped run wouldn't grind to a halt with a few arrests. It was too vast, too entrenched. The days that followed blurred into a relentless cascade of revelations. David's testimony tore open the underbelly of the police department, exposing a sprawling network of racial violence and corruption that reached from the greenest rookies to the gray-haired brass at the top. What chilled Louise to her core wasn't just the brutality, the beatings, the staged arrests, the covered-up killings, but the subtler, more insidious ways the oppression had festered. Officers falsified reports, planted evidence, turned a blind eye to complaints from black families pleading for justice. It wasn't chaos, it was calculated. A system honed over years to grind down anyone who didn't fit the mold Harper and his ilk had deemed acceptable. David sat there, day after day, sweat beading on his forehead. His shirt clinging to his back as he recounted every detail. Each memory he dredged up felt like a knife twisting in his gut, every time he'd slammed a black teenager against a wall for no reason. Every time he'd laughed off a mother's tears as she begged for her son's release. He'd told himself he was upholding the law, protecting the public, but now, stripped of that delusion, he saw himself for what he was, a cog in a machine of injustice, a willing hand in the suffering of countless lives. The faces of his victims haunted him. Their fear and confusion etched into his mind with a clarity that made sleep impossible. Louise, for her part, remained a steady presence, her questions relentless but her demeanor unshaken. She didn't flinch at the ugliness he laid bare, didn't soften the blow with false reassurances. "Do you understand what you've done?" she asked one afternoon, her voice slicing through the stale air. This wasn't just Harper's doing. It was a whole system, years of power twisted to crush black people under its heel. You weren't a bystander, David. You fueled it. You built it with your own hands. Your own hate. He couldn't meet her gaze. His eyes dropped to the scarred tabletop, tracing the scratches left by others who'd sat there before him, other liars, other cowards. He'd once seen himself as a guardian, a man of order, but now the truth was undeniable. He'd been an oppressor, a predator cloaked in a badge. The realization hollowed him out, leaving behind a shell of the man he'd thought he was. Every blow he'd struck, every life he'd upended, came rushing back, a flood of shame he couldn't outrun. "We've got enough to put Harper away." Along with plenty of others, Louise continued, her tone shifting to something colder, more resolute. "But I need more. Everyone who played a part, who stood by, who followed orders, who kept quiet." "What did you see, David? Tell me everything." His breath caught in his chest, a ragged inhale that rattled through him. "It wasn't just me," he said again, the words tumbling out faster now, fueled by a desperation to unburden himself. "Harper gave the orders, but we all ran with them. We'd patrol the black neighborhoods like hunters, looking for any excuse to pounce. A kid with a hoodie, a guy walking too slow, we'd stop them, rough them up, haul them in. Didn't matter if they were innocent. Harper drilled it into us, they were threats, every one of them. And we ate it up. We wanted to believe it." Louise's pen moved again, her handwriting sharp and precise, capturing every damning word. Outside, the precinct buzzed with the fallout, officers whispering about who'd be next, who'd turn, who'd fall. But in that room, it was just the two of them, locked in a dance of confession and consequence. David's story wasn't just about Harper, it was about the rot that had taken root in every corner of the force, a lesson in how power, unchecked, could twist justice into a weapon of hate. And as he spoke, he knew this was only the beginning, a single crack in a dam that would either hold or shatter under the pressure of what came next. The room felt suffocating, thick with an oppressive stillness that seemed to cling to every surface. Louise sat motionless, her lips sealed, letting the silence stretch out like a heavy fog. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was a presence, a mirror held up to David's trembling confessions, reflecting the grotesque weight of his words. Racism, he had admitted, wasn't merely a flicker of personal disdain buried in his heart. It was a beast, fed and nurtured, given legitimacy and power under the crisp blue uniform he once wore with pride. David and men like him had twisted the police department into something sinister, a weapon sharpened not for justice, but for oppression, its blade honed against the vulnerable. Louise's eyes locked onto David, steady and unyielding, piercing through the haze of his shame. Her voice, when it finally broke the quiet, was calm but carried an edge. Like the slow drip of water wearing down stone. "So, what's your next move, David?" she asked, her tone deliberate, each word a challenge. "Are you going to keep laying it all bare, testifying against Harper and the rest, or are you still clinging to some shred of loyalty, protecting the men who dragged you into this abyss?" Her gaze didn't waver, and in it, David saw no escape, no room for half-truths. David's chest tightened, his breath shallow and ragged. He sat slumped in the metal chair. The cold seeping through his sweat-soaked shirt, his hands fidgeting nervously on the table. He'd already cracked open the floodgates, words spilling out of him like blood from a wound, and now there was no turning back. The choice wasn't a choice anymore, it was a current dragging him under. "I'll keep talking," he said, his voice quivering, barely above a whisper. "I'll tell you everything, every time we faked investigations, rounded up innocent people. Covered for each other when the lines blurred too far." His eyes darted to the floor, unable to meet hers. "Harper and the others, they made racism our routine. It wasn't just hate. It was policy." Outside the dim, sterile walls of the interrogation room, Lieutenant John Harper felt the ground crumbling beneath him. The air in the precinct buzzed with whispers, rumors of the FBI's investigation snaking through the corridors like wildfire. Harper, once a towering figure of authority, now paced his office in a frantic haze, his polished shoes scuffing the linoleum floor. Time was slipping through his fingers, and he knew it. He'd spent years building this empire of control. A fortress of corruption shielded by badges and paperwork. Now, it was unraveling. Desperation clawed at him. He'd reached out to his web of allies, old friends in high places. Men who owed him favors, pleading, threatening, even tossing bribes into the mix like a gambler doubling down on a losing hand. But the FBI's net was tightening. Their leads multiplying like shadows at dusk. Every call he made went unanswered, every favor he called in met with silence or excuses. The loyalists who'd once flanked him, officers who'd laughed over beers after falsifying reports or burying complaints, were peeling away, distancing themselves as the heat closed in. Harper's world, once impenetrable, was fracturing, and he could feel the cracked spiderwebbing under his feet. The raid came at dawn, a brutal punctuation to his unraveling. Harper was still tangled in the sheets of his bed, the remnants of a restless sleep clinging to him, when the door splintered open. FBI agents stormed in, their boots thudding against the hardwood. Their voices sharp and commanding. He jolted awake, heart hammering, his mind racing to catch up with the chaos. Dragged from his bed, his bare feet scraped the cold floor as they hauled him upright. Gone was the swaggering lieutenant, the man who'd once barked orders with unshakable confidence. In his place stood a disheveled figure, hair mussed, eyes wide with shock. A king stripped of his crown. They slapped the cuffs on him, the metal biting into his wrists, and shoved him toward the waiting car. Yet even then, a flicker of defiance burned in Harper's gaze. He twisted his head toward the agents, his voice low and venomous, cutting through the morning chill. "Go ahead, arrest me," he spat. "But this system? It's bigger than me. You'll never tear it down. It'll outlast us all." His words hung in the air, a taunt laced with bitter truth. Louise watched from a distance, her face a mask of calm resolve. The scene unfolded before her like a play she'd seen too many times, Harper's downfall, the flashing lights, the agent's stern efficiency. She felt no satisfaction, no surge of triumph. Harper's words gnawed at her, not because they surprised her, but because they echoed a fear she'd wrestled with for years. The system he'd thrived in wasn't just a few bad apples, it was a sprawling, tangled root network, deep and resilient, fed by decades of apathy and abuse. A handful of arrests wouldn't uproot it. But that didn't mean she'd stop digging. Later, in the stark glow of the interrogation room, she turned to David again. "We don't need to burn it all down," she said, her voice firm but tinged with a quiet hope. "We'll change it, bit by bit. Starting with men like you and Harper." David didn't respond. His head hung low, his shoulders sagging under the weight of his betrayal, not just of Harper, but of the life he'd lived. He'd sold out his mentor, his brothers in blue, and now he'd have to face the consequences. But more than that, he knew the machine they'd built wouldn't grind to a halt with a few convictions. It was too vast, too entrenched. David's testimony poured out over days, each word a jagged shard of his past. His confessions didn't just bury Harper, they ripped open a festering wound, exposing a network of racial violence and corruption that stretched from rookie beat cops to the brass at the top. What chilled Louise to her core wasn't the scale of it, but the banality, the way these men had turned oppression into a daily grind. It wasn't just fists and guns, it was forged reports, ignored complaints, whispered orders to keep the black neighborhoods in line. David had been a cog in that machine, and now, sitting across from Louise, he was forced to reckon with it. Sweat beaded on his forehead, dripping down his temples as he spoke. The room felt like a coffin, the air stale and heavy. He'd spent hours recounting Harper's schemes, how they'd planted evidence, how they'd laughed off the screams of the innocent, but the memories that clawed at him most were his own. Every black face he'd targeted flashed before him. The teenager he'd slammed against a wall for no reason but the color of his skin, the mother he'd cuffed while her kids wailed, the old man he'd mocked as he dragged him to the precinct. He'd told himself he was upholding the law, keeping order. Now, staring into Louise's unflinching eyes, he saw the truth: he'd been a predator, cloaked in authority. Louise sat opposite him, her posture rigid, her expression a blend of steel and sorrow. She didn't flinch as he unraveled, didn't soften her gaze with pity. That unnerved him more than any outburst could have. Her quiet strength left no space for his excuses, no cracks for him to slip through. "Do you even grasp what you've done, David?" she asked, her voice soft but cutting, a scalpel slicing through his defenses. This wasn't just Harper's game. It was a whole system, built to crush black lives, and you didn't just play along, you fueled it. You poured your own hate into it, day after day. David's throat tightened, his hands trembling as he gripped the edge of the table. He'd once seen himself as a guardian, a man enforcing justice. Now, that image lay shattered. He'd beaten innocent people, humiliated them, locked them away, all because their skin marked them as threats in his twisted mind. The memories flooded back, vivid and unrelenting. The crunch of his baton against a young man's ribs, the smirk he'd shared with Harper after a clean arrest. "I wasn't just following orders," he muttered, his voice breaking. "I believed it. I thought they deserved it." Louise leaned forward slightly, her pen scratching across her notepad. "We've got enough to lock Harper away, along with plenty of others," she said. "But I need more. Every name, every incident you saw, not just Harper's orders, but everyone who played a part." "What did you witness, David?" Her tone was steady, but her eyes burned with an intensity that made him shrink. He swallowed hard, his bloodshot eyes lifting to meet hers. "It wasn't just me," he stammered. "Harper led it, sure. But there were others, dozens of us. He'd give the word to control the black areas. Suspicion was enough, no evidence, no questions. We'd swarm in, beat them down, haul them in. Sometimes just seeing a black guy walking through a white street was all it took. Harper drilled it into us: they couldn't be trusted, they were dangerous. And we bought it. I bought it." The silence returned, thick and suffocating, a mirror to the ugliness of his words. Louise didn't speak, letting the weight settle over him like a shroud. Racism hadn't been some fleeting prejudice, it had been etched into the badge, wielded as a tool to dominate. David and his kind had turned their power into a noose, tightening it around the necks of the innocent. And now, as the truth spilled from him, he understood, justice wasn't just about punishing Harper. It was about dismantling the lie he'd lived. The lie they'd all lived, a lie that power could excuse cruelty. The consequences of that abuse, Louise knew, would ripple far beyond this room, a lesson carved in the ruins of their corruption. The morning sun had barely crept over the horizon when the stillness of Harper's quiet suburban home shattered. The sharp crack of a battering ram against his front door jolted him awake, his heart pounding in his chest like a trapped animal clawing for escape. He stumbled out of bed, his mind racing, a chaotic swirl of dread and disbelief. For years, he'd reigned as a towering figure in the police department, a lieutenant whose word was law, whose arrogance masked the rot he'd nurtured within the system. Now, as FBI agents stormed through his house, their boots thudding against the hardwood floor, that illusion of invincibility dissolved. They yanked him from the warmth of his sheets, his wrists snapping into cold handcuffs, and dragged him outside into the pale dawn light. His neighbors peeked through curtains, their whispers already weaving a web of gossip. Harper's eyes, though, burned with a defiance that refused to flicker out. Turning to the agents as they shoved him toward the car, he spat out his words like venom, "You can lock me up, but this system? It's carved in stone. You'll never tear it down." Across town, David sat in a dimly lit interrogation room, the air thick with the stale scent of coffee and sweat. His hands trembled slightly as he spilled secrets he'd once sworn to bury, details of brutality, falsified reports, and the blood-stained cover-ups he'd orchestrated alongside Harper. Every word felt like a shard of glass cutting deeper into his conscience. He'd been Harper's right hand, a loyal soldier in their twisted empire. But now the weight of betrayal pressed against his chest. He'd turned on his mentor to save himself, yet the hollow ache in his gut told him there was no absolution waiting. The FBI agent across the table scribbled notes, her face unreadable, but David could feel the noose tightening. Outside, word of the investigation had spread like wildfire through the precinct, igniting panic among officers who'd once toasted Harper's name. Those loyal to him now scurried away like rats abandoning a sinking ship, leaving him to face the storm alone. Harper had seen this coming. The rumors had started weeks ago, whispers of federal agents sniffing around, of evidence piling up like bricks in a wall that would soon trap him. He'd paced his office late into the night, the hum of the fluorescent lights buzzing in his ears, desperation clawing at his thoughts. He'd reached out to his allies. Men in crisp suits and corner offices, offering bribes with a smile or threats with a glare. But the FBI's net was too wide, their leads too solid. They'd uncovered the ugly truth. Harper hadn't just shielded racist cops like David, he'd been the architect of a machine that churned out lies. False reports drafted under his watch had buried the deaths of unarmed civilians, their names erased from memory. Stacks of incriminating documents had vanished into shredders, their ashes a silent testament to his crimes. As the agents closed in, Harper's empire crumbled. And with it, any hope of escape. Louise stood at the edge of the chaos, her arms crossed as she watched Harper's arrest unfold. The wind tugged at her coat, carrying the faint sound of distant sirens, but her face remained a mask of calm. She'd spent years in the department. A quiet observer who'd seen the corruption fester like a wound no one dared to clean. Harper's words echoed in her mind, "This system will never change," and a part of her feared he might be right. The rot ran deep, its roots tangled in decades of silence and complicity. But surrender wasn't in her blood. Later, as she faced David in that sterile interrogation room, she leaned forward, her voice steady but fierce. "We don't need to burn it all down," she told him, her eyes locking onto his. "We'll rip it apart piece by piece, starting with you and him." David stared at the table, his silence heavy with the realization that his time was up. He'd gambled everything, loyalty, power, his soul, and lost. The FBI's investigation didn't stop with Harper's fall. It spread like a flood, washing over the department and exposing a network of corruption that stretched far beyond one man. High-ranking officials, their badges once gleaming with pride, now squirmed as their own sins came to light. They'd signed off on fabricated evidence, turned blind eyes to beatings, and pocketed bribes from those who profited off the suffering. Some scrambled to destroy files, their hands shaking as they fed papers into shredders, but it was too late. The FBI had already secured damning proof. Outside the precinct, the black community, long crushed beneath this oppressive weight, rose up. The streets thrummed with the rhythm of marching feet and voices raw with anger. Protests swelled, banners waving like battle flags, their cries for justice piercing the city's smog-choked air. A man stood before a news camera, his face etched with scars from a nightstick's kiss, his voice trembling but unbroken. "We're not the criminals here," he said, tears glistening in his eyes. "All we wanted was to live, but they beat us down because of our skin." The crowd roared behind him, their pain a thunderclap that shook the city awake. David couldn't escape the echoes of those voices. Locked in his cell, the concrete walls seemed to close in tighter each night. Sleep brought no relief, only nightmares of the faces he'd terrorized, their eyes wide with fear or dulled by resignation. He'd once worn his badge like a crown, convinced he was untouchable, a guardian of order. Now, he saw himself for what he'd been, a predator cloaked in authority, a puppet dancing on Harper's strings. His testimony had toppled his former boss, but the guilt clung to him like damp rot. He'd traded his freedom for a lighter sentence, yet the bars around him felt like a fitting cage for the monster he'd become. Harper, meanwhile, strutted into his trial with the same swagger he'd always carried. "I was just doing my job," he repeated, his voice a cold blade slicing through the courtroom's tension. But the evidence towered against him, recordings, witnesses, a paper trail of deceit that stretched across years. His defiance couldn't shield him from the life sentence that followed. A punishment that locked him away but left his belief unshaken: someone else would rise to take his place. The city didn't stand still, with Harper and his cronies behind bars. A tide of reform swept through the police department. New training rolled out, officers drilled in de-escalation and anti-racism until their old habits cracked. Internal affairs grew teeth, sniffing out misconduct with a vigor that made veterans sweat. Community boards sprang up, their members ordinary citizens with sharp eyes and sharper tongues, holding the force accountable. Louise took the helm of a task force, her days consumed by the slow, grinding work of change. She stood in her office late one evening, gazing out at the city's skyline, its lights flickering like fragile hope. The scars of corruption wouldn't fade quickly, too many lives had been shattered, too much trust broken. But she clung to the belief that each step forward mattered, that the voices rising from the streets could reshape what had been. David's cell offered no such view. Alone with his thoughts, he traced the path that had led him here. He'd once laughed at the idea of consequences, drunk on the power Harper had fed him. Now, that illusion lay in ruins. And all he had left was regret, a bitter taste that lingered in every breath. Harper, too, stewed in his own prison, his arrogance a brittle shell. "This system will outlast you all," he muttered to guards and inmates alike, his words a desperate grasp at relevance. But outside, the city hummed with a different tune. The police no longer loomed as an untouchable specter. Tentative trust began to bloom between uniforms and the people they'd once preyed upon. The road ahead stretched long and uncertain, but it glimmered with possibility. What lingered in the wreckage of Harper's reign wasn't just a tale of racism or corruption confined to one department. It was a stark lesson carved in the suffering of the innocent. When power turns tyrant, it's the powerless who bleed. Yet the community's unyielding spirit, paired with the quiet resolve of people like Louise, lit a torch in the shadows. Change crept forward. Slow but relentless, a testament to the truth that justice, though delayed, could still take root. The fall of Harper and his ilk stood as a warning: abuse your authority, and the consequences will find you, no matter how high you climb. And in that reckoning, a fragile hope emerged, that a system built on oppression could, piece by painstaking piece, be unmade and reborn. It seems like you're posing a thoughtful question about how to respond to injustice and racism, perhaps inspired by a story or message you'd like me to reflect on. As Grok, I'll share my perspective based on reasoning and a commitment to truth and fairness, values that align with XAI's mission to advance our collective understanding. If faced with injustice and racism, I wouldn't remain silent. Silence in the face of wrongdoing can perpetuate harm and enable systems or behaviors that undermine fairness. Standing up doesn't always mean loud confrontation, it could be through reasoned dialogue, exposing flaws in unfair systems with evidence, or amplifying voices that are being drowned out. The approach depends on the situation, but the principle is the same: inaction isn't neutral, it's a choice.